The woman everyone blamed a brutal beating in the town square. 6 daughters watching their mother bleed. One silent man who refused to look away. In 1876 Montana Territory, Eliza Hart committed the unforgivable sin of giving birth to 6 daughters and no sons. Her punishment? Public humiliation, starvation, and fists that left bruises where dresses couldn't hide them. The whole town watched her suffer and called it justice. But when a feared rancher named Caleb Rowan stepped between her and the next blow, everything changed. This is the story of a woman who learned to stand when the world demanded she kneel, and the man who saw her worth when no one else would. If you're watching from somewhere in this wide world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Eliza's story can travel. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Let's make sure her voice reaches every corner where someone needs to hear it. The first blow caught Eliza hard across the jaw, just as the Sunday church bells stopped ringing. She tasted copper and dust before her knees hit the boardwalk outside Morrison's general store. The pine planks were still warm from yesterday's sun, smooth against her palms as she braced herself. Around her, the good people of Salvation, Montana Territory stepped back, not to help, but to give her mother-in-law room to swing again. 6 times. Margaret Hart's voice carried across the town square like a preacher's sermon. 6 times my son put a child in your barren womb, and 6 times you gave him nothing but useless girls. Eliza kept her head down, watching blood from her split lip dot the dusty boards. 1 drop, 2, 3. She counted them because counting kept her from screaming, and screaming would frighten her daughters. She could feel them watching from inside the store window where Margaret had ordered them to stand. 6 pairs of eyes that looked exactly like their dead fathers, witnessing their mother's shame in the full light of a September afternoon. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. The second blow came from Margaret's son, Thomas Hart Jr., Eliza's brother-in-law. His boot caught her in the ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to make her gasp. Hard enough to remind her that she had no husband to protect her anymore, no home that couldn't be taken, no value beyond what these people decided she was worth. And they decided she was worth less than nothing. My brother worked himself to death trying to build something for his family. Thomas's voice shook with righteous anger. 12 years of marriage, and what did you give him? 6 mouths to feed and no son to carry his name, no boy to inherit his land. Nothing but girls who will just run off and marry the first man who will have them. Eliza pressed her hand against her ribs, where the pain bloomed hot and sharp. She'd had this conversation before, hundreds of times in the 2 months since her husband died. It always ended the same way, with her on the ground and them standing over her, using her body as proof of her failure. Please. The word came out thick through her swelling lip. The girls need to eat. If we could just what? Margaret's skirts rustled as she moved closer. Give you more of my dead son's money, more of his land, more of the resources he spent trying to turn you into a proper wife? I worked that land same as he did. Eliza kept her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking. I birthed those babies in that cabin. I earned... The word earned seemed to light something mean in Margaret's eyes. She nodded to Thomas, who reached down and grabbed Eliza by the arm, hauling her to her feet. His fingers dug into the bruises from 3 days ago, when they'd had this same argument in a different location with the same ending. You earned nothing. Margaret stepped so close Eliza could smell the lavender water she wore to church. A wife's duty is to give her husband sons. You failed, and now you expect us, his blood family, to pay for your failure? Through the store window, Eliza could see her oldest daughter, Clara, pressing her face against the glass. 12 years old and already learning that being female meant apologizing for existing. Behind Clara stood the others, Ruth, Mary, Anne, Johanna, and little Sarah, barely 4 years old, holding her rag doll like it might protect her from what she was seeing. Eliza had promised them this morning would be different, had promised that Grandma Hart would give them the food allowance she'd been withholding for 2 weeks, had promised they'd have flour for bread and maybe, if they were very lucky, a bit of salt pork to make it through the coming winter. She'd promised them they wouldn't go to bed hungry again. I'm not asking for charity. Eliza straightened as much as her ribs would allow. The land was in Thomas's name, but nothing. Margaret's hand shot out and gripped Eliza's chin, forcing her head up so the whole town could see her swelling face. This is what happens to women who can't fulfill their purpose. This is what happens when you take a man's name and give him nothing in return but disappointment. A small crowd had gathered now, not to intervene, but to witness. Salvation was a town built on certainty, and the people who lived here liked their rules clear and their judgments public. A woman who couldn't bear sons was a woman who'd failed her most basic duty. The fact that Eliza had tried 6 times only made it worse, like she'd been given chances and squandered everyone. Mrs. Peterson from the boarding house stood with her arms crossed. Mr. Chen from the laundry kept his eyes down but didn't leave. Even Reverend Matthews watched from the church steps, his face carefully neutral in that way men's faces got when they wanted to seem above worldly concerns while still enjoying the show. "I'll give you 1 month." Margaret released Eliza's chin with a small shove. 1 month to find yourself a new husband willing to take on another man's daughters. If you can't do that, and Lord knows I can't imagine who'd want you, then we're taking the girls. The words hit harder than any fist. No. Eliza's voice came out sharp and immediate. No, you can't. They're my children. They're heart children. Thomas moved to stand beside his mother, a united front of righteous judgment. And you've proven you can't provide for them. Can't even keep a roof over their heads without begging from us. I'm not begging. I'm asking for what's owed. Nothing is owed to a woman who can't do her duty. Margaret's voice dropped to something almost kind, which somehow made it worse. We'll take the girls, raise them properly, teach them what it means to be useful. And you, she looked Eliza up and down like she was appraising livestock. You can go find whatever life a barren woman deserves. The word barren echoed across the square. Several people nodded. A few looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the Hart family's authority. This was frontier justice, harsh and certain, and built on the understanding that some people mattered more than others. And Eliza Hart, it seemed, didn't matter at all. Please, she hated the pleading in her voice but couldn't stop it. Please don't take my girls. I'll find work. You'll what? Clean houses? Take in laundry? Margaret laughed, a brittle sound that scattered across the square like breaking glass. Women with reputations do that kind of work. Women the town respects. You think anyone here wants a woman who couldn't even keep her husband satisfied enough to stay alive? The cruelty of it, blaming her for Thomas Hart Sr.'s death from pneumonia, as if her failure to produce a son had somehow weakened his lungs, should have surprised Eliza. But she'd lived in Salvation long enough to know that people needed someone to blame for the unfairness of life. And a widow with 6 daughters and no sons made an easy target. 1 month, Margaret repeated. Find a husband or lose your children. Those are your choices. She turned to leave, Thomas following like a well-trained dog. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment over, the lesson delivered. Within minutes, the square was nearly empty except for Eliza kneeling on the boardwalk, tasting blood and fighting the urge to scream. The store door opened. Clara emerged first, her young face older than it should be, already learning to carry worry like women did. The other girls followed, clustering around their mother like birds around a wounded companion. Mama? Sarah's small voice was barely a whisper. Are you hurt? Eliza forced herself to smile even though it split her lip wider. I'm fine, sweet girl, just fine. It was a lie. They all knew it was a lie. But lies were sometimes the kindest thing a mother could offer. She let Clara help her stand, let Ruth brush the dust from her skirt, let Mary dab at her bleeding lip with a handkerchief that had been white that morning. Her daughters moved around her with the practiced efficiency of children who'd seen their mother beaten before and knew exactly how to help her pretend it didn't matter. We should go home, Clara said quietly. Home. The word felt hollow. The cabin 3 miles outside town had been home for 12 years, but it belonged to the Hart family now. Everything did. The land, the livestock, the furniture, all of it had passed to Margaret when Thomas died because women couldn't inherit property from their husbands. Women couldn't own anything that mattered. Women, Eliza had learned, were property themselves. Yes, she agreed, letting Clara guide her toward the wagon they'd borrowed, begged for, to make this trip to town. Let's go home. They climbed into the wagon bed in order of age, smallest to largest, a ritual they'd developed without anyone teaching them. Sarah sat in Eliza's lap. Johanna and Anne pressed against her sides. Mary and Ruth took the edges. Clara sat up front, taking the reins with hands that were too young to be so competent. No one spoke as they left Salvation behind. The road back to the cabin was rutted and rough, carved through prairie grass that had gone gold with approaching autumn. Eliza watched the landscape roll past and tried to inventory what she had. A wagon that wasn't hers, 6 daughters who were everything, a month to find a husband she didn't want, and bruises that would fade yellow before they disappeared. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The sun was starting its descent when Clara pulled the wagon to a stop outside their cabin. It was a decent structure. Thomas had been a capable builder, even if he'd been a cold husband, with 2 rooms, a good fireplace, and a root cellar that should have been full of provisions for winter, but stood mostly empty because Margaret controlled what supplies they received. "Stay in the wagon," Eliza said, though she knew they wouldn't listen. She climbed down carefully, her ribs protesting every movement. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, which was wrong because she'd locked it that morning. Her pulse quickened as she pushed it open. Someone had been inside. The destruction was methodical. Flowers scattered across the floor, the winter blankets pulled from their chest and trampled. Her mother's quilt, the only thing Eliza owned that had belonged to someone who'd loved her, slashed with a knife and left in ribbons on the bed. Margaret's message was clear. "You have nothing I can't destroy." Behind her, Eliza heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. The girls had followed her inside despite her instructions, and now they stood in the doorway staring at the ruins of their already meager home. "It's all right," Eliza said automatically. "It's not all right, Mama." Clara's voice cracked on the last word. Nothing is all right. She was right, of course. 12 years old and already too wise for the world she'd been born into. Eliza wanted to comfort her, wanted to promise that things would get better, wanted to be the kind of mother who had answers instead of just more questions. But she had nothing left to give except the truth. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's not all right, but we're going to survive it anyway." They spent the next hour cleaning what could be cleaned and salvaging what could be salvaged. The flour was a total loss. Too much dirt mixed in to be safe. The blankets could be washed, though they'd never be quite clean again. Her mother's quilt was beyond repair, just strips of fabric that had once held warmth and memory and now held nothing at all. By the time darkness fell, they'd restored a semblance of order to the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was something. Eliza built a small fire in the hearth and boiled water for the last of their oats, stretching the meal across 6 bowls by adding extra water until it was more soup than porridge. The girls ate without complaint. They'd learned not to complain about hunger, about cold, about fear. They'd learned to make themselves small and quiet and easy to overlook because children who demanded attention often got the wrong kind. "Mama," Sarah leaned against Eliza's shoulder after finishing her bowl. "Is Grandma Hart going to take us away?" The other girls went still, waiting for an answer. Eliza looked at each of her daughters in turn. Clara with her serious eyes and capable hands. Ruth with her quick mind and careful questions. Mary with her gentle heart that bruised so easily. Anne with her stubborn chin and fierce loyalty. Johanna with her quiet observation and surprising strength. And Sarah, still small enough to believe her mother could fix anything. "No," Eliza said. "No one is taking you anywhere." But she said, "I know what she said," Eliza kept her voice firm. "And I'm telling you that you're staying with me. All of you, no matter what I have to do." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep, but she said it anyway because sometimes the lie was more important than the truth. Sometimes children needed to hear that their mother was strong enough to protect them, even when she wasn't sure she could protect herself. They settled in for the night, all 7 of them in one bed because it was warmer that way, and because none of them wanted to be alone. Eliza lay awake long after her daughter's breathing had evened into sleep, staring at the rough ceiling beams and trying to see a path forward. 1 month to find a husband. The problem wasn't just finding a man willing to marry her, though that would be difficult enough given her reputation and her poverty and her complete lack of dowry. The real problem was finding a man willing to take on 6 children who weren't his. Most men wanted sons of their own, not another man's daughters. Most men saw children as liabilities unless they could work or bring wealth or continue a family name. Her daughters were none of those things. They were just 6 girls who deserved better than the world intended to give them. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The fire burned down to embers, and still Eliza couldn't sleep. She thought about Margaret's ultimatum, thought about the casual cruelty in her mother-in-law's eyes as she delivered it, thought about Thomas Jr.'s boot against her ribs, and the way the town had watched her suffer without intervening. She thought about her dead husband, who'd been neither kind nor cruel, just distant. A man who'd done his duty by her in the bedroom but found no joy in it. A man who'd grown quieter with each daughter's birth, his disappointment accumulating like snow on a roof, silent and heavy until it finally collapsed. She thought about the quilt her mother had made, now destroyed. Her mother had died when Eliza was 16, leaving her with nothing but that quilt and a piece of advice. Marry someone who sees you, not just what you can give them. Eliza had failed that advice. Had married Thomas because he'd asked, and because she'd had no other options, and because she'd been young enough to believe that any marriage was better than none at all. She wouldn't make that mistake again. If she had to marry to keep her daughters, she'd find someone who at least wouldn't make their lives worse. Someone who might not love them, but wouldn't hurt them either. Someone who understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. Someone who would let her keep breathing, keep fighting, keep surviving. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Eliza woke before the girls, her body stiff and aching from yesterday's beating. She built up the fire and assessed their supplies. Barely any food, no flour, a bit of dried meat that would last maybe 3 more days if she was careful. She'd need to go back to town, need to swallow her pride and beg Margaret for the allowance she was owed, need to endure whatever humiliation came with asking for help from people who'd rather see her starve. But first, she needed to make her daughters believe everything would be all right. "Morning, Mama." Clara emerged from the bedroom, already dressed. Always the first one up, always trying to help before she was asked. "Morning, sweet girl." Eliza managed a smile. "Help me make breakfast?" They worked together in comfortable silence, preparing a thin porridge from the last of the oats. When the other girls woke, they ate quickly and without complaint, even though everyone could see there wasn't enough. "I need to go to town today," Eliza announced after breakfast. The girls exchanged glances. They knew what town meant. More begging, more humiliation, more chances for their mother to come home bleeding. "I'll go with you," Clara said immediately. "No." Eliza's voice was gentle but firm. "I need you here with your sisters. I'll be back before dark." It was a 5-mile walk to salvation, farther than it seemed when riding in a wagon. Eliza set out just after sunrise, her body protesting every step, but her mind focused on the task ahead. She'd beg if she had to, grovel if necessary, whatever it took to get food for her daughters. The morning was beautiful in the way Montana mornings often were: big sky, clear air, grass rolling golden toward distant mountains, the kind of beauty that made you believe the world was good, even when you knew better. She was halfway to town when she heard the horse. The sound came from behind her, steady hoofbeats on packed earth. She moved to the side of the road without looking back, expecting whoever it was to pass without acknowledgement. That's how it worked when you were a woman of no consequence. But the horse slowed. "Mrs. Hart!" The voice was low and rough, like it didn't get used much. Eliza turned and found herself looking up at a man she'd seen around Salvation but never spoken to. He sat his horse with the easy competence of someone who'd been born in a saddle, his face weathered and hard to read beneath the brim of his hat. Caleb Rowan. She knew his name because everyone knew his name, the hermit rancher who lived in the hills north of town, who came to Salvation maybe once a month for supplies, who spoke to no one and wanted nothing from anyone. People whispered about him, said he was dangerous, said he'd killed a man back east and fled to the territory to escape justice, said he was half wild, more comfortable with cattle than people. Looking at him now, Eliza could believe the wild part. There was something untamed in the set of his shoulders, something fierce in the stillness of his gaze. "Mr. Rowan," she said, careful to keep her voice neutral. His eyes moved over her face, cataloging the bruises she couldn't quite hide. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Long walk to town," he said. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment, and Eliza fought the urge to look away. There was something unsettling about his attention, not threatening exactly, but intense, like he saw more than she wanted to show. "I'm heading that direction," he said finally. "You're welcome to ride." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a command either. Just an offer, delivered in a tone that suggested he didn't much care whether she accepted or not. Eliza hesitated. Accepting help from a strange man would add fuel to the already burning gossip about her reputation. But her feet hurt, her ribs ached, and she had a long day of humiliation ahead. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Thank you," she said quietly. He dismounted in one smooth motion and held out his hand. His palm was calloused and warm when she took it, his grip steady as he helped her mount. Then he swung up behind her, careful not to touch her more than necessary. They rode in silence. Eliza was acutely aware of his presence at her back, the solid warmth of him, the controlled strength in the way he managed the horse. He smelled like leather and pine and wood smoke, clean scents that reminded her of the mountains. "Your husband died 2 months back," he said after a while. "Not a question." "Yes, sir. And his family's been making it hard on you." She stiffened. "I don't need charity, Mr. Rowan." "Didn't say you did?" His voice held no judgment, just stating facts. They crested a small rise, and Salvation came into view below, a collection of buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast Montana sky. "The Hart family owns half this town," Caleb continued. "They're used to getting what they want." "I know that. And what they want is your daughters." Eliza turned her head sharply. "How do you— People talk." He guided the horse down the slope with practiced ease. "Even to men they think aren't listening." She wanted to ask what else he'd heard, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she watched the town grow larger as they approached, her stomach knotting with dread. "Thank you for the ride," she said as they reached the outskirts. "You can let me down here." He reined in the horse but didn't immediately help her dismount. "Mrs. Hart." She waited. "If you need help," he said slowly, like each word cost him something, "ask." It was the strangest offer she'd ever received, blunt and awkward and completely unexpected. She turned to look at him properly for the first time, trying to read his face. But Caleb Rowan's expression was as hard to decipher as ancient stone. "Why?" she asked. His eyes held hers for a long moment. "Because everyone else in this town is content to watch you suffer, and that doesn't sit right with me." Then he helped her down, tipped his hat, and rode away before she could formulate a response. Eliza stood at the edge of Salvation, watching him disappear around the corner of the livery stable, and wondered if she'd just encountered the first honest man she'd met in 12 years. The thought was dangerous. Honest men were rare as snow in summer, and hope was a luxury that had nearly killed her before. She couldn't afford to believe in either. But as she turned toward Margaret Hart's house, her ribs aching and her courage gathered like stones in her pocket, Eliza couldn't quite shake the memory of Caleb Rowan's words. "If you need help, ask." As if asking for help had ever been that simple, as if anyone had ever actually helped when she did. Margaret Hart's house sat at the center of Salvation like a queen on a throne, 2 stories of whitewashed wood that announced wealth and permanence in a territory where most people lived in single-room cabins. Eliza stood at the front gate, gathering what remained of her courage, before pushing through and walking up the stone path. She knocked 3 times and waited. The door opened to reveal Catherine, Margaret's housekeeper, a thin woman with perpetually pursed lips who'd never once looked Eliza in the eye during 12 years of family gatherings. "Mrs. Hart isn't receiving visitors today." "I'm not a visitor." Eliza kept her voice level. "I'm family, and I'm here for the household allowance she promised." Catherine's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Hart left no instructions about any allowance." "She said if I came today—" "I said she left no instructions." Catherine started to close the door. Eliza's hand shot out, stopping it. The gesture was bold enough that Catherine actually looked at her, surprise flickering across her pinched features. "My daughters need to eat," Eliza said quietly. "Please tell Margaret I'm here." For a long moment, they stood frozen in that tableau. Eliza's hand on the door, Catherine's mouth thin with disapproval. Then voices drifted from inside the house, Margaret's sharp tone cutting through the morning air. "Is that the Hart widow? Send her away. I have no patience for beggars before noon." The words carried clearly through the open door, meant to be heard. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't move her hand. "I'm not leaving until I get what's owed to my children," she called out, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Silence. Then footsteps on hardwood floors. Margaret appeared in the doorway, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than Eliza's entire cabin. She looked Eliza up and down with the same expression she might use to examine spoiled meat. "What's owed?" Margaret's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "You believe you're owed something? Thomas left provisions for the girls. You know he did. My son left his estate to his family, and you, dear girl, are no longer family, not in any way that matters." Eliza's jaw tightened. "I was his wife for 12 years. You were his disappointment for 12 years. Margaret stepped fully into the doorway, forcing Eliza back. "And now you stand on my porch demanding money as if you have any right to it, as if your failure to give my son what he needed entitles you to his legacy. The girls are his legacy. The girls are mouths to feed with no value in return." Margaret's voice dropped to something almost conversational. "Do you know what it costs to raise 6 children? To feed them, clothe them, prepare them for marriage? Of course you don't. You've never had to think about cost, have you? Just kept producing daughters and expecting someone else to shoulder the burden?" Each word was carefully chosen to wound. Eliza felt them land like stones, heavy and deliberate. "I'm not asking you to raise them," she said. "I'm asking for the allowance Thomas promised. Enough to get through winter. After that, I'll find work." "What work?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Who in this town would hire a woman with your reputation? A woman who couldn't even keep her husband satisfied enough to—" "Don't." The word came out harder than Eliza intended. "Don't speak about him like that. Thomas died of pneumonia, not dissatisfaction." "Did he?" Margaret tilted her head, studying Eliza with calculating eyes. "I wonder. A man without a son, without hope of carrying on his name, without anything to look forward to except more daughters. Perhaps he simply lost the will to fight the sickness. Perhaps you killed him with your inadequacy as surely as if you'd put a bullet in him." The cruelty of it stole Eliza's breath. She'd known Margaret was hard, had experienced her criticism and judgment countless times, but this was different. This was malicious. "That's not true," Eliza whispered. "Isn't it?" Margaret smiled. "Tell me, did my son ever look at you with anything other than duty? Did he ever touch you with anything resembling desire? Or did he simply do what was required, hoping each time that maybe, finally, you'd give him what a real woman should?" Eliza's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, wanted to strike the smug expression off Margaret's face, wanted to defend her dead husband's honor and her own. But rage was a luxury women couldn't afford, not when they needed something from the people who held all the power. "The allowance," she said instead, forcing her voice steady. "Please." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then turned to Catherine. "Give her $2. Not a penny more." $2 wouldn't buy enough flour to last a week, let alone get them through winter. Eliza opened her mouth to protest, but Catherine was already pressing coins into her palm and shutting the door with decisive finality. Eliza stood on the porch, staring at the 2 silver dollars in her hand, and felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Breaking would have been a relief. Just crack, a hairline fracture that would widen with time until everything collapsed. She descended the porch steps carefully, each movement deliberate. The morning sun was climbing higher now, warming the air, making salvation look almost pleasant. The illusion would have been convincing if you didn't know what lived beneath the surface. Morrison's General Store stood across the square. Eliza walked there slowly, trying to calculate how far $2 could stretch. Flour first. Then maybe a bit of lard. Perhaps some dried beans if any money remained. The girls would have to make do without meat, without sugar, without anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. They'd made do before. They'd make do again. The store was empty when she entered, which was a small mercy. James Morrison looked up from behind his counter, his expression shifting from neutral shopkeeper to uncomfortable recognition. "Mrs. Hart." He didn't quite meet her eyes. "What can I do for you?" 10 pounds of flour, please, and whatever dried beans $2 will buy after that." His hands stilled on the flour sack he'd been reaching for. $2 won't cover 10 pounds of flour. Prices have gone up. Of course they had. Eliza swallowed her frustration. How much flour can I get for $1.50? About 6 pounds, maybe 7 if I'm generous. 6 pounds of flour for 6 daughters, 1 pound each to last until… when? Until she found a husband? Until Margaret's deadline passed and she lost her children? Until she simply stopped being able to pretend everything would be all right? 7 pounds then, Eliza said, and whatever beans the remaining 50 cents will buy. Morrison measured out the flour with careful precision, as if giving her even an ounce more would bankrupt him. The beans he poured into a small cloth sack barely filled it halfway. That's 50 cents worth, he said, pushing both items across the counter. Eliza gathered her purchases, the weight of them insignificant in her arms but devastating in what they represented. This was survival reduced to its most basic mathematics, pounds of flour divided by hungry mouths, multiplied by days until disaster. She was turning to leave when Morrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Hart, there's something on your account. She froze. I don't have an account here. Someone opened one for you. Anonymous, paid in advance. Eliza turned back slowly. What are you talking about? Morrison looked distinctly uncomfortable now, his fingers drumming on the counter. A man came in yesterday, didn't give his name, left $20 credit in your name, said you're to get whatever you need, and he'll settle the bill at month's end. $20. That was more than she'd seen in months, more than Margaret would ever give her, more than she could hope to earn even if someone in town would hire her. Who? The question came out sharp. Like I said, he didn't leave a name, just paid and left. Big fellow, quiet. Keeps to himself mostly. The description was vague enough to mean almost anyone, but Eliza's mind went immediately to the man who'd given her a ride that morning. Caleb Rowan, with his careful words and unreadable face, who'd said to ask if she needed help. But this wasn't asking. This was him deciding she needed rescuing and doing it without permission. I can't accept anonymous charity, she said firmly. Morrison shrugged. Money's already paid. You don't use it. It just sits there. Seems foolish to let your girls go hungry out of pride when someone's offering help. He wasn't wrong. Pride had never filled a stomach or kept a child warm. But accepting money from a stranger, especially a man, would give the town's gossips exactly what they wanted. Proof that Eliza Hart was the kind of woman who took money from men who weren't her husband. Let me think about it, she said. Suit yourself. Credit will be here when you're ready. Eliza left the store with her meager purchases and headed out of town, her mind churning. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than the walk in, her body aching from yesterday's beating and her spirit aching from this morning's fresh humiliations. She was perhaps 2 miles from town when she heard hoofbeats again. This time she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel his presence before he spoke, that same intensity she'd noticed earlier. Mrs. Hart. Caleb Rowan pulled his horse alongside her, moving at her walking pace. He didn't offer her a ride this time, just rode beside her in silence for several minutes. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. Did you pay Morrison to open an account in my name? Yes. No excuses, no explanations, just the simple acknowledgement of fact. Why? She demanded. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. Because your daughters shouldn't starve while you have pride. It's not pride, it's… She struggled to find the right word. It's complicated. Nothing complicated about hunger. He glanced down at her. Your girls need food. I have money. Seems simple to me. People will talk. People already talk. His voice held no judgment, just observation. About you, about me, about everyone who doesn't fit their narrow view of how the world should work. What's a little more gossip? Eliza stopped walking, forcing him to rein in his horse. You don't understand what you're doing. If people think I'm taking money from you, from any man, it'll be worse than it already is. Worse how? They going to beat you more? Starve you more thoroughly? His jaw tightened. Seems to me it can't get much worse than it already is. He wasn't wrong about that either. But accepting his help felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Not because she thought he'd hurt her, There was something fundamentally decent in the blunt way he spoke, but because depending on anyone, even temporarily, meant giving them power over her, and Eliza had learned the hard way what men did with power over women. "I can't pay you back," she said quietly. "Didn't ask you to." "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, but something that might have been disappointment. "I want," he said slowly, "for you to be able to feed your children without begging from people who hate you. That's all. Men don't give things without expecting something in return. Some men do." He gathered his reins. "I'm heading back to my ranch. You're welcome to use Morrison's credit or not. Your choice." He started to ride away, and Eliza felt something twist in her chest. Here was a man offering help without conditions, without demands, without any of the strings she'd learned to watch for, and she was refusing him out of fear and suspicion born from 12 years of learning that kindness always came with a price. "Mr. Rowan?" He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said, "for the credit, for seeing." That made him look back at her. His face was still hard to read, but his voice was softer when he spoke. "You're welcome, Mrs. Hart." Then he rode away, leaving her standing in the middle of the road with 7 pounds of flour and a strange ache in her chest that felt almost like hope. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of careful survival. Eliza swallowed her pride and used Morrison's credit to buy what her daughters needed: flour and beans and dried meat, enough to make proper meals for the first time in months. She saw Caleb in town once during that time, loading supplies outside the general store. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded. She nodded back. Neither spoke. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed. She heard the whispers in Morrison's store, felt the weight of disapproving stares when she walked down the street. The women of Salvation began crossing to the other side of the road when they saw her coming, as if poverty and impropriety might be contagious. Only Caleb Rowan remained unchanged, distant and silent, and somehow present in ways that mattered more than words. On the 15th day after Margaret's ultimatum, Eliza was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard a wagon approaching. She shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun and felt her stomach drop. Thomas Hart, Jr. sat in the driver's seat, his mother beside him, both wearing expressions of grim determination. Behind them, in the wagon bed, sat Sheriff Coleman, and a thin man in a dark suit who could only be a lawyer. They'd come for her daughters. Eliza's hand stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line. Inside the cabin, she could hear her girls playing, Clara reading to the younger ones, their voices light and unconcerned. They didn't know yet that everything was about to change. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the cabin. Margaret descended with Catherine's help, her black dress immaculate despite the dusty road. Thomas jumped down and moved to stand beside his mother, a united front of Hart family authority. Sheriff Coleman climbed out more slowly, his weathered face apologetic but resigned. The lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, if Eliza remembered the town gossip correctly, clutched a leather folder against his chest like armor. "Mrs. Hart," Margaret's voice carried across the yard, "I believe we had an agreement." Eliza carefully set down the laundry basket and walked forward, positioning herself between the wagon and her cabin, between these people and her daughters. "The month isn't up yet," she said. "Close enough." Margaret gestured to Mr. Whitmore. "We've come to collect the children, for their own good, naturally." "Naturally?" Eliza echoed, her voice flat. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat and opened his folder. "Mrs. Hart, I've been retained by the Hart family to ensure proper custody arrangements for the minor children of the late Thomas Hart Sr. As you are currently unable to provide adequate care, I'm providing perfectly adequate care. With money from an unmarried man." Margaret's smile was sharp. "Yes, the whole town knows about your arrangement with Caleb Rowan, taking money from a bachelor rancher, letting him pay your bills. People have drawn their own conclusions about what services you're providing in return." Heat flooded Eliza's face. "That's a lie. He's just helping, is he?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "How generous of him, and what, pray tell, does he expect in return for his generosity?" "Nothing. He expects nothing." "How remarkably naive you are." Margaret turned to Sheriff Coleman. This is exactly why these children need proper guardians. Their mother is consorting with strange men, accepting money under suspicious circumstances, teaching her daughters that this is acceptable behavior for women. Sheriff Coleman looked distinctly uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Hart, I'm sure there's an explanation. The explanation is simple, Margaret interrupted. She's a woman of questionable morals trying to raise 6 girls alone. It's inappropriate, it's dangerous, and it's exactly the kind of influence we need to protect these children from. Eliza's hands clenched into fists. You're twisting everything. Caleb Rowan helped because you refused to, because you wanted us to starve. I wanted you to find a husband, which you failed to do. Margaret's voice turned colder. You had a month to secure proper arrangements for your children. You've done nothing except accept charity from a man who clearly expects favors. That's not true. Then marry him. Margaret said it casually, like she was suggesting a change of dress. If Mr. Rowan is so invested in your welfare, surely he'd be willing to make it official. Unless, of course, he's already getting what he wants without the inconvenience of marriage. The words hit like a physical blow. Eliza opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. How could she defend herself against accusations designed to be indefensible? If she denied a relationship with Caleb, it made his help look like payment for services. If she claimed they were courting, Margaret would demand proof. There was no winning move in this game. Mama? Clara's voice came from the cabin doorway. She stood there with her sisters clustered behind her, all 6 girls staring at the wagon full of people who'd come to take them away. Go back inside, sweet girl, Eliza said, trying to keep her voice steady. Are they here for us? Clara's young face was too knowing, too aware. Are they taking us away? No one's taking you anywhere. Mrs. Hart, Mr. Whitmore stepped forward, his voice professionally sympathetic. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. The children will be well cared for in the Hart household. They'll have proper food, proper education, proper supervision. They have that here. Do they? Margaret gestured at the cabin with its patched roof and weathered walls. This is barely better than living in a barn. The girls sleep in one bed, wear dresses made from flour sacks, and subsist on charity from a man who's only interested in one thing. Stop it, Eliza said through clenched teeth. The truth hurts, doesn't it? Margaret's smile was cruel. You know what you are. The whole town knows. And we will not allow 6 innocent girls to be corrupted by your example. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat again. Mrs. Hart, if you could just— No! The word came out fierce and final. Everyone stopped. Even Margaret looked momentarily surprised. No, Eliza repeated, louder this time. You're not taking my daughters. I don't care what lies you've spread or what papers that lawyer has. These are my children, and you can't have them. Actually, Mr. Whitmore said apologetically, the law is quite clear on matters of maternal unfitness. Given your current circumstances and the testimony of respected community members— Respected? Eliza's laugh was bitter. You mean people who've decided I'm worthless because I gave birth to daughters instead of sons? People who've watched me get beaten and did nothing? Those respected community members? Mrs. Hart, please. My name is Eliza. The shout startled everyone, including herself. My name is Eliza Hart, and I am their mother, not Mrs. Hart, not Thomas's widow, not the woman who failed to bear sons. I'm Eliza, and I love my daughters more than anything in this world, and you can't take them from me because you've decided I'm not good enough. Silence fell across the yard. Even Margaret seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Then Clara stepped forward. We don't want to go with you, she said clearly. We want to stay with our mother. Sweetheart, you don't understand Margaret started. I understand perfectly. Clara's voice was remarkably steady for a 12-year-old. You think we're burdens. You think Mama's worthless. But she's the one who held us when we cried, who made sure we had food even when she went without, who kept us safe even when she was scared. She's our mother, and we're staying with her. Ruth stepped forward next. It's right. Then Mary, then Anne, then Johanna, holding Sarah's hand. 6 girls standing together, choosing their mother over wealth and comfort and everything the Hart family could offer. Eliza's throat closed with emotion. She wanted to tell them they didn't have to do this, that they could have better lives with the Harts, that loving her didn't mean they had to sacrifice their futures. But the words wouldn't come. Margaret's face hardened. Children don't get to choose their guardians. Sheriff Coleman, if you would— I don't think that's going to happen. The new voice came from the road. Everyone turned to see Caleb Rowan sitting on his horse, watching the scene with those unreadable eyes. He must have been there for a while, listening. Eliza felt a fresh wave of embarrassment. He'd heard every accusation Margaret had thrown at her. "This is a private family matter, Mr. Rowan," Margaret said coldly. "It doesn't concern you. You made it concern me when you started using my name to justify taking those children." Caleb dismounted in one smooth motion. "So let's clear something up right now. I gave Mrs. Hart money to feed her daughters because I have money, and they were hungry. Nothing more complicated than that." "How noble," Margaret said. "And you expect us to believe you want nothing in return?" "I don't much care what you believe." Caleb walked forward until he stood beside Eliza, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "But I won't stand by while you twist kindness into something ugly to serve your own purposes. This isn't about kindness. This is about what's best for those girls is staying with their mother." His voice cut through Margaret's words like a blade. "Anyone with eyes can see she loves them. Anyone with a conscience would help instead of making things harder." Margaret's expression turned calculating. "You seem remarkably invested in Mrs. Hart's welfare, Mr. Rowan. One might wonder why a bachelor rancher would involve himself so thoroughly in a widow's affairs." "One might wonder a lot of things." Caleb's jaw tightened. "But the facts are simple. Mrs. Hart needs help. Her daughters need food and shelter, and you're using her vulnerability to steal children from a woman who's never done anything except fail to meet your impossible expectations." "Impossible?" Margaret's voice rose. "A son! That's all my boy wanted. One son to carry his name. Is that so impossible?" "For her? Yes." Caleb's response was blunt. "Because she's not the one who decides what children come, and punishing her for that is cruelty dressed up as righteousness." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one seemed to know how to respond to such plain speaking, to have the thing everyone knew but never said stated so baldly. Finally, Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, the legal situation remains—" "The legal situation," Caleb interrupted, "is that Mrs. Hart hasn't been proven unfit. She's poor, but poverty isn't a crime. She's accepted help, but that's wisdom, not moral failure. And if the law says children should be taken from a loving mother and given to a woman who calls them burdens, then the law is wrong." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Rowan, I understand your position, but do you?" Caleb turned to face him directly. "Because from where I stand, you're about to help tear 6 little girls away from the only parent who wants them. You comfortable with that?" The sheriff's weathered face creased with conflict. He'd known these children since they were born, had seen Eliza at church and market, had probably witnessed some of the beatings she'd endured. And now he was being asked to facilitate more harm in the name of the law. "Mrs. Hart," he said slowly, "if you had proper support, a stable home, evidence that you could provide for the children without questionable assistance." "She'll have it." Everyone turned to stare at Caleb. "She'll have what?" Margaret demanded. Caleb looked at Eliza, his expression impossible to read. "Mrs. Hart, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The words seemed to echo across the yard, impossible and absolute. Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her feet, felt every eye turn toward her, felt the weight of a question she'd never expected to hear. "What?" The word came out barely above a whisper. Caleb's expression remained steady, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Marry me. Give those girls a stable home with 2 parents. Give yourself a name that carries weight in this territory." He paused. "Give the Harts no legal ground to stand on." It wasn't a romantic proposal. There was no tenderness in his voice, no declaration of feeling. It was a transaction offered in the same blunt tone he might use to discuss cattle prices or fence repairs. But looking into his eyes, Eliza saw something that made her chest tighten. Not pity, but a fierce determination that matched her own desperate need to protect her daughters. "You can't be serious," Margaret said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I'm always serious." Caleb didn't look at her, his attention fixed entirely on Eliza. Mrs. Hart? I need an answer. Eliza's mind raced through possibilities and consequences. Marrying a man she barely knew, binding herself to someone who might turn cruel once he had legal authority over her and her children, trading one form of dependence for another. But the alternative was watching her daughters loaded into that wagon, watching them taken to a house where they'd be raised to believe their mother was worthless, and they themselves were burdens. She thought of Clara's steady voice declaring they wanted to stay, thought of 6 little girls choosing poverty with love over wealth without it, thought of what it would mean to lose them, to know they were alive somewhere in this town but beyond her reach. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Yes, I'll marry you. Margaret's face went pale with fury. This is absurd. Sheriff Coleman, surely you can see what's happening here. This is clearly an arrangement designed to circumvent... To circumvent what? Caleb turned to face her fully. The law says a married woman with a working husband has the right to raise her children. You want to challenge that, take it to a judge. But I'm guessing you won't, because any judge worth his appointment will see this for what it is. A land grab dressed up as concern for children. Land grab? Thomas Jr. spoke for the first time, his face flushed. That cabin and the 40 acres it sits on belong to my brother. It's Hart property. Was Hart property, Caleb corrected. Until Eliza marries me. Then it becomes community property of our marriage. You take those girls, you lose any claim to that land. He smiled without warmth. Funny how maternal fitness becomes less important when property's at stake. The silence that followed was thick with barely contained rage. Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her careful composure cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. You think you're clever, she said to Caleb, her voice shaking. You think you can ride in here and play hero. But you don't know what you're taking on. 6 children who aren't yours. A woman with a reputation that'll drag your name through the mud. Poverty and struggle, and I know exactly what I'm taking on. Caleb's voice cut through her words. A woman who's been beaten and starved and humiliated, who kept standing anyway. 6 brave girls who chose their mother over comfort. Seems to me that's worth more than reputation or easy living. Eliza stared at him, trying to reconcile this fierce defender with the silent man who'd barely spoken to her before today. He'd been watching, she realized, not with the prurient interest Margaret implied, but with the careful attention of someone who recognized injustice and finally decided to act. Sheriff Coleman shifted his weight, his weathered face troubled. Mrs. Hart, you're sure about this? Marriage is a serious undertaking, and Mr. Rowan here, well, he's not known for being sociable. Neither am I, apparently, Eliza said. Seems like we'll suit each other fine. This is a farce, Margaret spat. A mockery of marriage. You can't possibly... Can't what? Eliza turned to face her mother-in-law directly. Can't find a man willing to marry me? You're the one who gave me a month to do exactly that. Well, I've done it. Not the way you expected, maybe, but I found a husband. One who won't beat me for failing to bear sons. One who sees my daughters as children worth protecting instead of burdens to resent. He's using you, Margaret said desperately. Can't you see that? He wants the land, wants... I don't want the land, Caleb interrupted quietly. I have 300 acres of my own. Don't need 40 more. Then what do you want? Thomas Jr. demanded. Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from Eliza to the 6 girls still clustered in the doorway, then back to Margaret's furious face. I want, he said slowly, to live in a world where children aren't used as weapons against their mother, where a woman isn't punished for biology she can't control, where basic human decency means something more than maintaining social order. He paused. Doesn't seem like too much to ask. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had developed. If Mrs. Hart remarries, the legal grounds for removing the children do become significantly weaker. Assuming, of course, that Mr. Rowan can provide adequate... I can provide. Caleb's voice was flat. I have a house, land, livestock, and money in the bank. More than adequate by any reasonable measure. And your character? Margaret's voice dripped venom. What do we know about your character, Mr. Rowan? You live alone in the hills, come to town maybe once a month, speak to no one. For all we know, you're a criminal hiding from the law. I'm not. He said it simply, without defensiveness. I came to Montana Territory 5 years ago after my parents died. Bought land, built a ranch, kept to myself because I prefer animals to people. No crimes, no warrants, no secrets. Just a man who values quiet over conversation. How convenient, Margaret sneered. And now you suddenly develop an interest in a widow and her brood of daughters. You'll forgive me if I find that suspicious. Find it whatever you like. Caleb turned back to Eliza. We should go to town. Get the marriage done before they have time to find new objections. The practicality of it, the absence of romance or ceremony or any acknowledgement that they were talking about binding their lives together, should have bothered Eliza more than it did. But romance was a luxury for people who had choices. She had 6 daughters and a future measured in days before Margaret found another way to take them. Now? She asked. Now. He looked at Sheriff Coleman. You can perform marriages, can't you? The sheriff nodded slowly. I can, but folks usually prefer to have Reverend Matthews. Reverend Matthews will have opinions, Caleb said. Lots of them. I'd rather keep this simple. Margaret stepped forward, her face twisted with fury. You cannot do this. I won't allow it. You don't have a say in it, ma'am. Sheriff Coleman's voice held a note of finality. Mrs. Hart is a widow, free to remarry as she chooses. Mr. Rowan is an unmarried man of legal age. If they want to marry, that's their right. This is insane. Thomas Jr. looked between his mother and the sheriff, searching for support. You're just going to let them what? Get married? Coleman shook his head. That's not something that requires my permission or yours. Eliza could see Margaret calculating, searching for another angle of attack, but Caleb had outmaneuvered her. A married woman with a capable husband couldn't be declared unfit simply for being poor. The Hart family's claim on the children, and more importantly, on the land, would evaporate the moment Eliza became Mrs. Caleb Rowan. Girls, Eliza called softly, come here, please. They emerged from the cabin slowly, arranged themselves beside their mother like a defensive wall of flour sack dresses and serious faces. Sarah clung to Clara's hand. Johanna stood close enough to touch Eliza's skirt. They were frightened, she could see, but trying to be brave. This man's name is Caleb Rowan, Eliza said, her voice gentle despite the tension crackling through the air. He's asked me to marry him. If I say yes, we'll go live at his ranch, all of us together. You'll have a home where no one can take you away from me. She paused, looking at each daughter in turn. But I need you to understand. I don't know him well. I can't promise it'll be easy or comfortable. I can only promise we'll be together. That's all we want, Mama, Clara said quietly. To stay with you. The simple truth of it nearly broke Eliza's composure. She swallowed hard against the emotion rising in her throat and turned to Caleb. They come with me, she said. All of them. If that changes your offer, it doesn't. He looked at the girls with that same unreadable expression. I knew what I was asking when I asked it. Margaret made a sound of disgust. This is madness. Coleman, I want it noted that this marriage is clearly a sham designed to... Noted, the sheriff said tiredly. Doesn't change the legality of it. Then I'll contest it. I'll take this to the territorial court. You'll lose. Caleb's voice was quiet but certain. Because no judge is going to rule that a mother providing for her children through marriage is grounds for removing those children. You know it, and I know it, and the longer you argue, the more it looks like this was never about the girls' welfare at all. The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Margaret's face flushed red, then white, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response that wouldn't prove his point. We're leaving, she finally said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. But this isn't over. You haven't won, Mr. Rowan. You've just delayed the inevitable. We'll see, Caleb said mildly. Margaret climbed back into the wagon with Catherine's assistance, her movements sharp and angry. Thomas Jr. followed, his face sullen. Mr. Whitmore gathered his papers and joined them, looking relieved to be leaving. Only Sheriff Coleman lingered, his expression troubled. Mrs. Hart, he said quietly, you're sure about this? Eliza looked at Caleb, really looked at him, trying to see beyond the weathered face and careful distance. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching the heart wagon depart, his expression revealing nothing of what he might be thinking or feeling. He just offered to marry a woman he barely knew, take on 6 children who weren't his, and make himself a target for the Hart family's considerable influence in salvation. And he'd done it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. "I'm sure," she said. Coleman nodded slowly, then turned to Caleb. "You understand what you're taking on? 6 daughters isn't like taking on hired hands. They'll need feeding and clothing and education. They'll need a home where they're safe and wanted," Caleb interrupted. "I can provide that." "Can you provide patience, understanding? These are children who've been through trauma. They won't be easy." For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across Caleb's face. "Sheriff, I've gentled wild horses and nursed orphaned calves and convinced a temperamental bull to trust me enough to load into a stock car. I figure children can't be more complicated than that." "Children," Coleman said dryly, "are considerably more complicated than that." "Then I'll learn," Caleb's voice held no doubt. "Same way I learned everything else, by paying attention and not giving up when it gets hard." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right. If you're both determined to do this, we might as well make it official. My office is in town. We can handle the paperwork there." He glanced at the girls. "All of you will need to come. Witnesses and such." They made an odd caravan heading back to Salvation, Sheriff Coleman's wagon in front, Caleb riding alongside on his horse, Eliza and her daughters in the back of their borrowed wagon. The girls were unusually quiet, processing the rapid change in their circumstances. Even Sarah, who usually chattered like a magpie, sat in subdued silence. "Mama?" Mary's voice was small. "Is Mr. Rowan nice?" It was such a simple question, and Eliza had no simple answer. She didn't know if Caleb Rowan was nice. Didn't know if he was patient or kind or capable of affection. She knew he was blunt and solitary and apparently unwilling to watch injustice without acting. But nice? That was a luxury question for people with choices. "He's helping us," she said instead. "That's what matters right now." "But will he be like Papa?" Ruth asked, her voice careful in that way it got when she was trying to understand adult complexities. "Will he be angry when we're too loud? Will he want us to be quiet and invisible?" The questions pierced Eliza's heart. Her daughters had learned to make themselves small, to move through the world apologizing for their existence. Thomas Sr. hadn't been cruel exactly, just perpetually disappointed that his children weren't sons. The girls had grown up feeling like consolation prizes in a game their father was losing. "I don't know what he'll be like," Eliza admitted, "but I promise you this. If he hurts any of you, we'll leave. I don't care about marriage vows or legal obligations. You come first. Always." Clara reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. The gesture was so adult, so full of understanding beyond her years, that Eliza had to look away to hide the tears threatening to fall. They reached Salvation just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The town looked almost pretty in the golden afternoon light, its roughness softened by distance and angle. Sheriff Coleman led them to his small office behind the general store, a cramped room that smelled of tobacco and old paper. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into a back room. Eliza stood with her daughters clustered around her, suddenly aware of how they must look. 7 females in worn dresses, dirty from travel and work, their hair imperfectly braided, their faces marked by hunger and hardship. This was what Caleb Rowan was choosing to take on. This ragged collection of poverty and struggle and need. He stood near the window, his attention seemingly on the street outside, but Eliza noticed the way his shoulders tensed when footsteps passed the door. He was nervous, she realized, or at least uncomfortable. This situation wasn't easy for him either, even if he hid it better than she did. "Mr. Rowan?" The words came out before she could stop them. He turned, his expression questioning. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. 5 years ago, I watched a woman get beaten in the street in Denver. Her husband was drunk, angry about something that probably didn't matter. She fell, and he kept hitting her, and people just walked past, stepped around her like she was a mud puddle to avoid. He paused, his jaw tight. I was young enough then to think interfering would help. So I pulled him off her, took a few punches for my trouble, helped her up. You know what she did? Eliza shook her head. She thanked me. Then she went home with him, because she had 3 children and no money and nowhere else to go. Because being beaten was still better than watching her kids starve. His eyes met hers. I've thought about that woman every day since. Wondered if she's still alive. Wondered if those kids grew up learning that's just how the world works. And this is... Eliza struggled to find the words. Redemption? This is me not walking past anymore. He said it simply, without drama or self-congratulation, just a fact. You needed help. I could give it. Seemed like the equation was that simple. It's not simple at all, Eliza said quietly. You're binding yourself to a woman you don't know, taking on children who'll need more than you probably understand, making yourself a target for the Hart family and everyone else in this town who thinks I'm not worth helping. Maybe, he shrugged, but I've been a target before. I'll manage. Sheriff Coleman returned with a leather-bound ledger and several sheets of official-looking paper. He settled behind his desk with the air of a man preparing for an unpleasant task. All right, he said. Let's make this official. Mr. Rowan, Mrs. Hart, stand here, please. They moved to stand before his desk. Eliza was acutely aware of the space between her and Caleb, close enough to suggest intimacy, far enough to acknowledge the truth of their arrangement. This wasn't a love match. This was survival dressed up as matrimony. Do either of you have any impediment to this marriage? Coleman asked formally. Prior spouses? Undisclosed illnesses? Concerns about consent? No, they said in unison. Mrs. Hart, you understand that upon marriage, your property and person come under your husband's legal authority? That he'll have the right to manage your affairs, make decisions regarding the household, and... I understand, Eliza interrupted. She understood perfectly. She was trading one form of powerlessness for another, hoping this new master would be kinder than the last. Coleman turned to Caleb. Mr. Rowan, you understand that you're taking on financial responsibility for Mrs. Hart and her 6 daughters? That their debts become your debts, their needs your obligation? I understand. And you're entering into this marriage freely? Without coercion or ulterior motive? Caleb's mouth quirked slightly. Define ulterior motive. Mr. Rowan, Coleman said warningly. I'm entering freely, Caleb confirmed. My motives are my own business. The sheriff sighed and picked up his pen. Very well. By the authority granted to me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. Mr. Rowan, you may... He paused, glancing at the 6 young witnesses watching with wide eyes. Well, you may seal the marriage with a handshake, I suppose. It should have been funny, the awkwardness of it, the departure from tradition, the practical absurdity of sealing a marriage with a handshake like a business deal. But Eliza felt no urge to laugh as Caleb extended his hand. His palm was calloused and warm when she took it, his grip firm but careful. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face the same careful determination she felt in her own chest. This might not be the marriage either of them imagined, but it was the one they needed. Mrs. Rowan, he said quietly. The name felt strange, foreign, like trying on someone else's clothing and finding it didn't quite fit. But it was hers now, for better or worse. Mr. Rowan, she replied. Coleman made several notations in his ledger, then pushed papers across the desk for them to sign. Eliza's hand shook slightly as she wrote her name, Eliza Rowan, for the first time. The ink seemed to take forever to dry, each second stretching into uncertainty. Congratulations, Coleman said, though he didn't sound particularly celebratory. You're legally married. I'll file these papers with the territorial recorder tomorrow. He looked at Caleb seriously. You take care of them. All of them. Or you'll answer to me. Yes, sir, Caleb said. They emerged from the office into late afternoon sunshine. The street was quiet, most people inside preparing supper or finishing the day's work. Eliza stood on the boardwalk with her daughters and her new husband, trying to process the fact that everything had changed in the space of an hour. She was married, again, to a man who was essentially a stranger, a man who'd just taken on responsibility for 7 people he had no blood tie to, no emotional connection with, no reason to care about except some abstract sense of justice. "We should head to the ranch," Caleb said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. "It's about an hour's ride. We can make it before full dark if we leave now." "We need to get our things from the cabin," Eliza said. "Tomorrow." He looked at the wagon they'd borrowed. "That belonged to you?" "No, we borrowed it from the Jameson farm." "I'll return it tomorrow. Collect your belongings then. Tonight, you come with me, all of you." He turned to the girls. "Any of you know how to ride?" 6 heads shook in unison. Caleb considered this, then nodded. "Clara, you're the oldest. You'll ride with me. The others can double up on the draft horses for my wagon. It's not comfortable, but it's possible." It took some arranging, but eventually they were all mounted. Awkwardly, uncertainly, but mounted. Clara sat in front of Caleb on his tall bay gelding, her back straight with the responsibility of being chosen first. Ruth and Mary shared one of the draft horses. Anne and Johanna took the other. Sarah, too small to ride alone, sat in front of Eliza on Caleb's spare mount. They made a strange procession leaving Salvation, one man leading 7 females on borrowed horses into the hills as the sun painted everything gold. People stared from windows and doorways. Eliza could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their certainty that this marriage was either a scandal or a tragedy waiting to unfold. Let them think what they wanted. She had her daughters. She had a husband who'd chosen to help rather than harm. For now, that was enough. The ride took longer than an hour with inexperienced riders and borrowed horses. Caleb led them north into rolling hills covered with pine and aspen, following a trail that was barely visible in the fading light. The girls were quiet, probably exhausted from the day's emotional upheaval. Sarah dozed against Eliza's chest, her small body warm and trusting. Full darkness had fallen by the time they crested a final rise and Caleb's ranch came into view. It wasn't what Eliza expected. She'd imagined something rough and temporary, a bachelor's cabin, hastily built and carelessly maintained. Instead, she saw a solid 2-story house with a wide porch, several outbuildings arranged with practical efficiency, and corrals built from pine logs that had been peeled and fitted with obvious skill. This was a home. Not temporary shelter, but a place someone had built to last. "It's not fancy," Caleb said, misreading her silence for disappointment. "But it's solid. Roof doesn't leak, walls keep out the cold. There's a well with good water and a root cellar that stays cool in summer." "It's wonderful," Eliza said honestly. He glanced at her, something that might have been relief flickering across his face. Then he dismounted and reached up to help Clara down. One by one, they all climbed off the horses. The girls clustered together again, staring at the house with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. This was supposed to be home now, but it belonged to a stranger. Everything here, the porch they stood on, the door Caleb was unlocking, the rooms they'd sleep in, belonged to a man they'd met hours ago. Caleb lit a lamp just inside the door, warm light spilling across a main room that was larger than their entire cabin had been. It was sparsely furnished but clean, a long table with benches, chairs near a massive stone fireplace, shelves lined with books. The walls were bare of decoration, but the space felt solid, permanent, safe. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, gesturing to a doorway. "Bedrooms upstairs. There's 3 of them. You and the girls can figure out who sleeps where." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "I'll sleep in the bunkhouse until things are more settled." It was a kindness Eliza hadn't expected, acknowledging that despite the marriage certificate, they were still strangers who needed space and time. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, then moved to the fireplace and began building up the coals that still glowed from morning. "I'll get a fire going, then show you where things are. You'll be hungry." It was statement, not question. And he was right. They were all hungry. The meager breakfast of thin porridge long since burned away by the day's stress. Within minutes, Caleb had a fire blazing and was pulling food from the kitchen: bread, cheese, sliced ham, apples. Simple fare, but abundant in a way the girls clearly weren't used to. They ate with careful politeness, trying not to appear too eager, but Eliza saw how quickly the food disappeared. Caleb ate standing up, leaning against the mantel, watching them with that unreadable expression. Eliza wondered what he saw. 7 strangers who'd invaded his carefully constructed solitude, disrupting the quiet life he'd built. 7 people who'd need things from him every day for years to come. "Mr. Rowan," she said quietly, "we should talk about expectations, about how this arrangement will work." He was silent for a moment, then set down his plate. "Tomorrow. Tonight, you're all exhausted. We'll figure out details when everyone's rested." It was practical advice, but Eliza's mind was too full for sleep. She had 1,000 questions about how they'd manage this strange household, about what he expected from her as a wife, about whether his kindness would last or fade once the novelty wore off. But the girls were drooping with exhaustion, Sarah already half asleep against Clara's shoulder. Questions could wait. For tonight, they had shelter and food and safety. That was more than they'd had this morning. "Come on, girls," Eliza said softly. "Let's find your beds." Caleb led them upstairs with the lamp, showing them 3 bedrooms arranged along a hallway. The largest had a proper bed with a real mattress. The 2 smaller rooms had rope beds that would need mattresses, but the frames were solid and well made. "I'll bring up spare blankets," Caleb said, "and tomorrow we can figure out mattresses and proper bedding." The girls claimed rooms with quiet efficiency, Clara and Ruth taking the smallest room, Mary and Anne the middle one, Johanna and Sarah the third. That left the large bedroom for Eliza, a space bigger than anywhere she'd slept in 12 years. Caleb brought up armfuls of blankets and quilts, enough to make comfortable nests even without proper mattresses. The girls helped distribute them, their movements slow and mechanical with exhaustion. "Mama?" Sarah's small voice came from the doorway of her room. "Are we safe here?" It was the question they were all thinking, but only the youngest was brave enough to ask. Eliza knelt down and pulled her youngest daughter into a hug. "Yes, sweet girl, we're safe here." "Grandma Hart can't take us away?" "No, she can't take you away." Sarah nodded against Eliza's shoulder, then pulled back to look at her seriously. "I like Mr. Rowan. He has kind eyes." Eliza glanced up to find Caleb still in the hallway, close enough to have heard. Their eyes met, and she saw something shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "All of you. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about everything else." He descended the stairs, and Eliza heard the front door open and close as he headed to the bunkhouse. She helped the girls settle into their makeshift beds, tucking each one in with whispered reassurances and gentle kisses. When they were all finally quiet, exhausted enough that sleep came quickly, despite the unfamiliar surroundings, Eliza retreated to the large bedroom and sank onto the edge of the bed. She was married, living in a stranger's house, bound to a man she knew almost nothing about. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, her daughters were safe. The tears came then, silent and overwhelming. Relief and fear and gratitude and uncertainty all mixed together until she couldn't tell which emotion was which. She cried into her hands, trying to stay quiet so the girls wouldn't hear, trying to process everything that had happened in one impossible day. Outside, through the window, she could see a light in the bunkhouse where Caleb had gone. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted his impulsive proposal, whether he understood what he'd truly taken on. She wondered if kindness could survive the daily reality of 7 people who needed so much. She wondered if she'd just traded one prison for another, or if maybe, just maybe, she'd found something different. A home. Not perfect, not familiar, but a place where her daughters could sleep without fear. It wasn't everything, but tonight, it was enough. Morning came too early, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and birdsong that sounded different from the sparse trees around their old cabin. Eliza woke disoriented, her body aching from yesterday's tension and the unaccustomed softness of a real mattress. For a confused moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then reality crashed back with the weight of everything that had changed. She was married to Caleb Rowan, living in his house, responsible for making this impossible arrangement work. Voices drifted up from downstairs, her daughter's quiet murmurs, and a deeper rumble that could only be Caleb. Eliza dressed quickly in yesterday's wrinkled dress, finger-combed her hair into something resembling order, and descended the stairs to find her new husband teaching her daughters how to make flapjacks. The scene was so unexpected that she stopped on the bottom step, just watching. Caleb stood at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, demonstrating how to pour batter onto the hot griddle. Clara watched intently, absorbing every detail the way she always did. Ruth asked questions about heat and timing. Mary worried aloud about burning them. The younger girls sat at the table, faces bright with the novelty of watching a man cook. "The key is waiting for bubbles," Caleb was saying, his voice patient in a way Eliza hadn't heard before. "See how they form on top? That's when you flip. Not before, or it'll be raw in the middle. Not after, or it'll burn." "Like this?" Clara asked, wielding the spatula with careful concentration. "Exactly like that." He glanced up and saw Eliza. Something shifted in his expression, not quite embarrassment, but an acknowledgement that she'd caught him being unexpectedly domestic. "Morning, coffee's on the stove?" "Morning?" She moved into the kitchen, acutely aware of how strange this felt. Being in someone else's space, using someone else's things, navigating the morning routine of a household that wasn't hers. "You didn't have to cook." "Had to eat anyway." He stepped back to let Clara handle the next flapjack. "Figured your girls should learn where the food is, how things work. Place belongs to them now, too." The casual way he said it, like the girls had an actual claim to this house, like they belonged here, made Eliza's throat tight. She poured coffee from the battered pot and wrapped her hands around the cup, needing something to hold on to. The flapjacks were good, better than anything Eliza had managed to make in months, when flour had been scarce and hope scarcer. The girls ate with genuine appetite, no longer trying to hide their hunger. Caleb ate standing up again, watching them with that careful attention that seemed to be his default state. "After breakfast, I need to ride out and check the cattle," he said. "Shouldn't take more than a few hours. While I'm gone, you all can settle in. Explore the place, figure out where things are." He paused. "I brought your belongings from the old cabin early this morning. Everything's on the porch." Eliza blinked. "When did you—" "Left before dawn. Figured you'd want your things." He set down his plate. "Also stopped by Morrison's, settled your account. Told him you won't be needing the credit anymore." The practical efficiency of it, solving problems before she even knew they needed solving, was almost overwhelming. Eliza opened her mouth to thank him, but he was already moving toward the door. "Clara, you're in charge while I'm gone. There's a bell on the porch if anything urgent happens. Ring it loud and I'll hear it, even from the far pasture." He settled his hat on his head. "Make yourselves at home." Then he was gone, leaving Eliza alone with 6 daughters in a house that was supposed to be home but felt like someone else's museum. "Well," Clara said into the silence, "should we bring our things inside?" They spent the next hour carrying boxes and bundles from the porch to the upstairs bedrooms. Everything they owned fit into 3 crates and 2 flour sacks, clothes worn thin from use, a few dishes that had belonged to Eliza's mother, the girls' rag dolls, books so worn the covers had separated from the spines. It was pathetic, really, seeing their entire life condensed into so little. But when they unpacked it all, distributing dresses and treasures and small comforts into the spacious rooms, something shifted. The bedrooms stopped feeling like temporary shelter and started feeling like places where real people lived. "Mama, look," Sarah called from her room. "There's a window seat. I can sit here and see the mountains." Eliza found her youngest perched in the deep windowsill, her rag doll clutched to her chest, her face alight with wonder. Through the glass, the mountains rose in jagged peaks against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Eliza said softly. "Is this really ours? Can we really stay here?" The question held such desperate hope that Eliza had to look away. "Yes, sweet girl. This is really ours." It was a lie, of course. The house belonged to Caleb. Everything in it belonged to Caleb. And by the laws that govern Montana Territory, Eliza and her daughters now belonged to him too, property transferred through marriage certificate and witness signatures. But Sarah didn't need to know that. Not yet. Not when her face glowed with the simple joy of having a window seat and a view of mountains. They explored the rest of the house after unpacking, discovering a pantry stocked with flour and beans and salt pork, a root cellar cool and dark with stored vegetables, a closet full of blankets and linens. Caleb Rowan might live alone, but he lived with the preparedness of someone who understood Montana winters and the value of being self-sufficient. In the barn, they found chickens in tidy coops, 2 milk cows with gentle eyes, and horses that nickered curiously at the girls' approach. There was hay stacked to the rafters, tools hung with methodical precision, and everywhere evidence of careful maintenance and planning ahead. "He's rich," Ruth said wonderingly, running her hand along a workbench smooth with use. "Isn't he, Mama?" "He's comfortable," Eliza corrected, though Ruth wasn't wrong. Compared to what they'd had, compared to most people in Salvation, Caleb Rowan was wealthy. "He's worked hard and been smart with his money. And now we get to live here." Mary's voice was small, like she was afraid to believe it. "With all this food and space and safety," Anne finished quietly. Safety. That's what this place represented. 4 walls that Margaret Hart couldn't breach, land that couldn't be taken away, resources that meant her daughters wouldn't go to bed hungry. Safety purchased through a marriage certificate, and a man willing to shoulder burdens that weren't his to carry. Eliza wondered how long that willingness would last. Caleb returned in early afternoon, his horse lathered from hard riding. He unsaddled and brushed down the animal with practiced efficiency before joining them on the porch where Eliza had set the girls to mending their worn dresses. "Everything all right with the cattle?" she asked. "Mostly. Found some fence down on the south boundary. I'll need to fix it tomorrow." He settled into one of the porch chairs, his body relaxing in increments like he was consciously allowing himself to rest. "You all settled in?" "Yes, thank you for bringing our things." He nodded, watching the girls work their needles through fabric. The silence stretched, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. Just 2 people who didn't know each other trying to navigate new territory. "We should talk," Eliza said finally, "about how this will work. What you expect from me as your wife." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "I expect you to take care of this house and your girls. Keep things running while I'm working the ranch. That's about it." "That's it?" She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "What else would there be?" Heat crept into her face. "You're my husband. Legally, you have rights to my time, my labor, my—" She couldn't quite make herself say the word. Understanding dawned in his expression. "Oh, that." He shifted in his chair, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm not interested in forcing unwanted attentions on a woman who married me out of desperation. When you want that to change, if you ever want it to change, you'll let me know. Until then, we're just 2 people sharing a house and trying to survive." The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. She'd been bracing herself for demands, for conjugal rights exercised regardless of consent, for the kind of intimate violation that was legal within marriage, even when it felt like assault. "You mean that?" she said, searching his face. "I don't say things I don't mean." He met her eyes directly. "This marriage is a legal arrangement to protect you and your daughters. It doesn't have to be anything more than that. But people can expect whatever they want. Doesn't make it their business." He stood, clearly ready to end the conversation. "I need to check the irrigation. You need anything from town, let me know before Saturday." He left before she could respond, striding toward the fields with that same purposeful economy of movement. Eliza sat on the porch, watching him go, trying to reconcile this man with everything she'd learned about what men wanted from women. "Mama?" Clara appeared in the doorway. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, sweet girl, everything's fine." More lies. Or maybe not lies exactly, hopes dressed up as certainties. Everything wasn't fine. It was strange and uncertain and built on foundations that could crack at any moment. But for now, for today, they were safe and fed, and no one was taking her daughters away. That was fine enough. The days developed a rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, worked until dusk, came in for meals, but otherwise kept his distance. Eliza managed the house, cooked meals, tended the garden she discovered behind the barn, and tried to make sense of this new life. The girls adapted faster than she did, their resilience both heartbreaking and reassuring. Claire took to helping with barn chores, following Caleb around with questions about cattle and horses and fence repair. He answered her patiently, teaching her things most fathers would have taught sons. Ruth discovered Caleb's small library and lost herself in books about astronomy and natural history. Mary helped with cooking, her gentle nature drawn to the nurturing work of feeding people. Anne and Johanna explored the woods, bringing back treasures, interesting rocks, bird feathers, wildflowers. Sarah followed Caleb like a duckling, her young heart already decided that this quiet man who never raised his voice was worthy of trust. Eliza watched it all from a careful distance, waiting for the other boot to drop, waiting for Caleb's patience to wear thin, for his kindness to reveal itself as manipulation, for the price of safety to finally come due. It didn't happen. A week passed, then 2. Margaret Hart made no move against them, though gossip drifted back from town whenever Caleb went for supplies. People were talking, naturally, speculating about why a bachelor would suddenly marry a widow with 6 daughters, whether the marriage was real or just a legal fiction, what arrangements might exist behind closed doors. Let them talk. Eliza had learned to armor herself against gossip. What she hadn't learned to armor herself against was genuine kindness sustained over time. Each morning she woke expecting to find Caleb's patience exhausted, his generosity depleted. Instead, she found breakfast ingredients set out for whoever woke first, clean water drawn from the well, small repairs made to things she hadn't even mentioned were broken. He fixed the latch on Sarah's bedroom door that had been sticking, built a higher shelf in the pantry so Clara didn't have to stretch so far, brought home fabric from town without being asked, enough to make new dresses for all 6 girls. "You didn't have to do that," Eliza said when he presented the bolts of calico and cotton. "Girls are growing. They need clothes that fit." He said it like it was obvious, like providing for children who weren't his blood was just part of the natural order. She made the dresses, working late into the night by lamplight, her fingers remembering the rhythm of needle and thread. It felt strange to sew with good fabric, to not have to piece together scraps or make do with flour sacks. Strange and somehow precious. This small act of creating something new, instead of just repairing what was broken. The 3rd week brought a visitor. Eliza was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon approaching. She recognized the driver immediately, Margaret Hart, her face set in lines of grim determination, but she wasn't alone. Beside her sat Reverend Matthews and Mr. Whitmore the lawyer, a triumvirate of authority come to deliver judgment. Eliza's hands stilled on the wet sheet. For a moment, fear paralyzed her. They'd found some legal loophole, some way to invalidate the marriage, some justification to take her daughters after all. Then Clara appeared at her elbow, solid and calm. "Should I ring the bell for Mr. Rowan?" Eliza looked at her oldest daughter, so young and already so brave, and felt something harden in her chest. She'd spent 12 years being afraid, 12 years letting other people's judgment determine her worth. Maybe it was time to stop. "No," she said, "I'll handle this." She walked to meet the wagon, her spine straight and her fear pushed down deep where it couldn't show. Margaret descended with her usual imperious grace, the men following like attendants to royalty. "Mrs. Rowan," Margaret's use of her new name sounded like an insult. "We need to speak with you." "Then speak." Margaret's mouth tightened at the blunt response. "Privately. Anything you have to say can be said in front of my daughter." Eliza felt Clara move to stand beside her, providing silent support. The Reverend cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Rowan, there have been concerns raised about the circumstances of your marriage, questions about whether it was entered into freely or under duress, questions about whether it constitutes a legitimate union or merely a legal fiction designed to—" "Stop." Eliza's voice cut through his pastoral meandering. "You want to know if my marriage is real? Fine. It's real. It's legal. And it's none of your business what happens inside my house." "Actually," Mr. Whitmore interjected, "in matters concerning the welfare of minor children, the territorial court has jurisdiction to investigate." "Investigate what? My daughters are fed, clothed, safe, and happy. What exactly are you investigating?" "We've received reports," Margaret said coldly, "that you and Mr. Rowan maintain separate residences, that he sleeps in the bunkhouse while you occupy the main house. Such arrangements hardly constitute a legitimate marriage." Heat flooded Eliza's face. They'd been watching. Somehow, they'd been spying on the ranch, cataloging comings and goings, building a case against her based on where people slept. "My sleeping arrangements are private," she said tightly, "not when they suggest fraud." Margaret smiled, sharp and triumphant. "A marriage in name only, designed to circumvent legal custody proceedings. I believe a judge would find that quite interesting. What would you have me do? The question came out harder than Eliza intended. Force myself on my husband? Demand conjugal rights? Would that satisfy your prurient interest in my bedroom? The Reverend flinched. Mr. Whitmore looked away. But Margaret just smiled wider. What I would have you do is admit this marriage is a sham. Give up your daughters to people who can raise them properly. Stop this charade before you damage them further. The only person damaging my daughters is you. Eliza stepped forward, close enough to see the calculation in Margaret's eyes. You, with your constant criticism, your beatings, your insistence that they're worthless because they're female. You, who would rather see them torn from their mother than admit you were wrong. Wrong about what? Margaret's voice rose. Wrong to expect a wife to give her husband sons? Wrong to hold you accountable for your failure? Wrong to think children are commodities to be valued based on gender. Wrong to punish me for biology I can't control. Wrong to use innocent girls as weapons in your vendetta against a daughter-in-law who had the audacity to survive your son's death. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what would happen next. How dare you, Margaret breathed. How dare you speak to me that way? How dare I? How dare you? Eliza felt something break loose inside her, 12 years of swallowed anger finally finding its voice. You beat me in the street. You starved my children. You destroyed my home and tried to steal my daughters. And you have the gall to act offended when I finally speak the truth? Mrs. Rowan, Reverend Matthews said weakly, perhaps we should all calm. I am calm. Eliza's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. For the first time in 12 years, I'm perfectly calm, because I finally understand something. You can't hurt me anymore. I'm not under your authority. I'm not dependent on your charity. I'm married to a man who treats me with basic human decency, and there's nothing you can do about it. We can prove the marriage is fraudulent, Margaret snapped. Then do it. Take us to court. Present your evidence that two adults who legally married are somehow not really married because they don't conform to your expectations of marital intimacy. Eliza crossed her arms. I'm sure the territorial judge will find that fascinating testimony. Mr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Rowan, while the sleeping arrangements are unusual, they don't necessarily constitute grounds for annulment. However, if you were to admit the marriage was entered into solely for legal protection, I admit nothing. My marriage is my business. What's going on here? Caleb's voice came from behind her. Eliza turned to find him approaching from the barn, his expression hard and his hand resting on the rifle he carried for dealing with predators. Not threatening exactly, but not welcoming either. Mr. Rowan, Margaret drew herself up. We were just discussing the legitimacy of your marriage. Were you? He stopped beside Eliza, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. Interesting conversation to have on private property without invitation. We have concerns about the children's welfare. The children are fine. You can see them if you look. Clara's right there, and the others are in the house, fed, clothed, safe, happy. Your concerns are noted and dismissed. You can't simply dismiss. I can on my own land. Caleb's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were ice. Now, you've said your piece. Time to leave. Margaret's face flushed with rage. This isn't over. We'll take this to the territorial court. We'll prove this marriage is a fraud designed to... To what? Protect children from being taken by people who view them as burdens? Caleb shook his head. Good luck with that argument. Most judges I know tend to favor keeping children with parents who want them. She's not their only parent anymore. You are. And if this marriage is legitimate, you have just as much right to custody as she does. Margaret's smile turned vicious. Tell me, Mr. Rowan, what happens if you decide you don't want 6 daughters after all? What happens if you decide they're too much trouble, too expensive, too burdensome? The law gives you the right to send them wherever you choose. The implication hung in the air like poison. Caleb could, legally, give the girls to the Harts, could decide tomorrow that this arrangement was too much and simply hand over custody. Everything Eliza had fought for could be undone by the man standing beside her. That's not going to happen, Caleb said flatly. Isn't it? How long before the reality of 6 children wears down your charitable impulses? How long before you realize what you've taken on? I knew what I was taking on when I proposed. His voice never rose, but something in it made Margaret take a step back. 6 daughters who deserve better than they've gotten. A woman who's been beaten down by people who should have protected her. A situation that required someone to actually give a damn instead of just passing by. How noble, Margaret sneered. And when nobility fades into resentment, when you tire of playing savior to a woman who couldn't even give her first husband a son, then I'll still be married to her, because I made a commitment and I keep my word. He turned to Reverend Matthews. You were there. You recorded the marriage. You know it's legal. Unless you've got actual evidence of fraud, not speculation, not gossip, but evidence, then this conversation is over. The Reverend looked supremely uncomfortable. The sleeping arrangements do raise questions. About what? My private life? Caleb's laugh was harsh. I sleep where I sleep. My wife sleeps where she sleeps. How that's anyone's business is beyond me. In matters of marital fraud, there's no fraud. We're married. The girls are legally my daughters now. And unless you've got a court order saying otherwise, you're trespassing on my property. Mr. Whitmore pulled a document from his folder. Actually, we do have an order for a welfare inspection of the minor children. The court wants to ensure they're being properly cared for in this new arrangement. Caleb took the paper, scanned it, then handed it to Eliza. It looked official enough, seals and signatures and legal language about the welfare of minor children requiring periodic oversight. Fine, Caleb said. Inspect. The house is clean, the children are healthy, there's food in the pantry and wood for the winter. Look all you want. Margaret's expression suggested this wasn't the reaction she'd hoped for. We'll need to speak with the children, privately, to ensure they're not being coached. No. Eliza's voice was sharp. The court order allows for— I don't care what it allows. You're not interrogating my daughters. She looked at Mr. Whitmore. Does that order specifically require private interviews with minor children? The lawyer hesitated. It allows for such interviews if deemed necessary by the inspecting party. Deemed necessary by you, you mean? Eliza shook her head. No. You want to see the children, you can see them with me present. You want to inspect the house, fine. But you're not getting my girls alone where you can fill their heads with lies about how their mother doesn't really love them. We would never, Reverend Matthews started. You beat me in front of them, Eliza interrupted. You told them I was worthless. You tried to take them away. Don't stand there and pretend you have their best interests at heart. Margaret's control finally snapped. You ungrateful wretch. Everything we've done has been for those children. To save them from a mother too proud to accept her own inadequacy. To give them a chance at respectable lives instead of being raised by a woman who— That's enough. Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. You've inspected. You've seen the children are fine. Now leave my property before I have Sheriff Coleman remove you for harassment. You can't threaten us, Margaret sputtered. Not a threat, a promise. He stepped forward, his size and presence suddenly intimidating in a way he usually kept carefully hidden. You've got no legal standing here anymore. The girls are legally mine. The land is legally mine. And if you set foot on my property again without explicit invitation, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. The court has its inspection. I'll send a written report of the children's welfare within the week, signed by me as their legal father. That satisfy the order? Mr. Whitmore glanced at the paper, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Technically, yes, though the court might request follow-up inspections. Let them request, through proper channels, not through ambush visits designed to intimidate. Caleb gestured toward the wagon. Now, I've asked politely. Next time I won't. For a long moment, Margaret stood her ground, rage and frustration warring on her face. Then she turned sharply and climbed into the wagon. This isn't over, she said coldly. We'll be watching. And the moment you slip, the moment those children show any sign of neglect or mistreatment, we'll be back with real legal force. Looking forward to it, Caleb said mildly. They left in a cloud of dust and barely suppressed fury. Eliza watched them go, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and reaction. She'd stood up to Margaret, had spoken truth to her face, had refused to back down even when threatened with legal action. Mama? Claire's voice was small. Are they really going to take us away? Eliza turned to find all 6 girls clustered on the porch, having witnessed the entire confrontation. Their faces showed varying degrees of fear and uncertainty, and she wanted to reassure them, wanted to promise everything would be fine. But Caleb spoke first. No, he said simply. They're not going to take you anywhere. You're my daughters now, legally, and I protect what's mine. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, seemed to settle something in the girls. Their shoulders relaxed, their breathing eased. They believed him in a way they'd never quite believed Eliza's reassurances. Because he was a man and men had power, and his word carried weight that hers never could. It should have made Eliza angry, that reality. Instead, she just felt grateful. Inside, girls, she said gently, there's mending to finish before supper. They filed back into the house, leaving Eliza alone with Caleb on the yard. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Thank you, she finally managed. For what? For standing with me, for not letting them bully us, for, she struggled to find words, for meaning it when you said you protect what's yours. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. They're going to keep coming. You know that, right? Margaret Hart doesn't strike me as someone who gives up easily. I know. And if they find anything, any excuse at all to claim the children aren't being properly cared for, they'll use it. I know that too. He turned to look at her directly. Then we need to make sure they find nothing, which means this marriage needs to look real, not just on paper, but in ways the town can see and verify. Eliza's stomach clenched. What are you saying? I'm saying I need to move back into the house, into our bedroom, so if they come spying again, they can't claim we're living separate lives. He held up a hand before she could protest. I'll sleep on the floor, I'll respect your privacy, but we need to present a united front, and that means sharing living space. It was logical, practical, the smart move to protect against future legal challenges. But the thought of sharing a bedroom with a man, even one who'd promised not to touch her, made Eliza's skin crawl with old fear. I don't... She couldn't finish the sentence. I know. His voice was gentle. And I meant what I said before. I won't force anything on you. But if we're going to convince people this marriage is real, we need to at least look like we share a bed. He was right. She knew he was right, but knowing didn't make it easier to agree. All right, she said quietly. Move into the house. We'll figure out the rest as we go. He nodded, then headed toward the bunkhouse to collect his things. Eliza stood in the yard, watching him go, and wondered if she'd just made things better or infinitely more complicated. That night, Caleb moved his belongings into the large bedroom. A single trunk, some clothes, his rifle, and cleaning kit. He made a pallet on the floor by the window, using blankets and spare bedding to create a sleeping space that was clearly separate from the bed. This work? He asked, gesturing to the arrangement. Eliza stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. The room suddenly felt smaller with his presence in it, his things mixed with hers, his scent of leather and pine invading the space she'd claimed as sanctuary. It's fine, she lied. They established an awkward routine. Caleb would wait outside while she changed for bed, then enter only after she was safely under the covers. In the morning, she'd stay in bed until he'd dressed and left for morning chores. They moved around each other like dancers learning a complicated step, careful not to touch, careful to maintain the fiction of privacy within shared space. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did. Days passed. A week. Margaret didn't return, but Eliza felt the weight of being watched, of knowing that somewhere in Salvation, people were cataloging their movements and looking for evidence of fraud. She made sure the house was immaculate, made sure the girls were well fed and properly dressed, made sure anyone who saw them would see a family thriving, not just surviving. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted between her and Caleb. The careful distance began to feel less like strangers coexisting and more like partners working toward a common goal. He started leaving the bedroom door open while he read at night. She stopped hiding under the covers until he left in the morning. They had brief conversations about the day's work, the girls' progress, small decisions that needed making, It wasn't intimacy, but it was something, a foundation perhaps for whatever this strange marriage might eventually become. 3 weeks into their shared bedroom arrangement, Eliza woke to find Caleb's pallet empty and morning light already streaming through the window. She'd overslept, a luxury she hadn't allowed herself in years. Downstairs, she could hear the sounds of breakfast being prepared, Clara's voice giving instructions, Ruth asking questions, the younger girl's laughter. When she descended the stairs, she found Caleb at the stove again, teaching the girls how to make proper biscuits. Flour dusted his shirt and Sarah's small hands were covered in dough, her face scrunched in concentration as she tried to shape the biscuits the way he'd shown her. Not too much handling, he was saying patiently. The more you work the dough, the tougher they get. Light touch, quick work. Like this? Sarah held up a misshapen lump. Exactly like that. He didn't correct the imperfect shape, just nodded approval and moved to help Johanna with hers. Something in Eliza's chest tightened watching them. This man who'd claimed to prefer animals to people was standing in his kitchen covered in flour, teaching 6 girls the patient art of making biscuits rise properly. He caught her watching, and something flickered in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but an acknowledgement that she'd seen something he usually kept hidden. "Coffee's ready," he said. "Thank you." She poured herself a cup and settled at the table, content to watch her daughters learn from a man who treated their questions as worthy of real answers. The biscuits came out golden and fluffy, better than anything Eliza had managed in recent memory. They ate together at the long table, passing butter and jam, the girls chattering about their plans for the day. It felt almost normal, almost like a real family instead of a carefully constructed arrangement. After breakfast, Caleb announced he needed to ride into Salvation for supplies. "I'll come with you," Eliza said. He raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Town's going to talk." "Town's already talking. Might as well give them something to actually see." She turned to Clara. "You're in charge while we're gone. Keep your sisters close to the house." The ride to Salvation was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Eliza sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his presence, the steady competence of his hands on the reins, the solid warmth of his shoulder occasionally brushing hers when the wagon hit ruts in the road. "You don't have to do this," he said eventually. "Going into town with me. People will assume things." "Let them assume." Eliza kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of being ashamed of needing help. If Salvation wants to judge me for marrying a good man who treats me with decency, then let them judge." "Good man." He said it like he was testing the words. "That's generous, considering you barely know me." "I know enough. I know you've kept every promise you made. I know you're patient with my daughters. I know you could have demanded things from me by law, but chose not to." She glanced at him. "That's more than most men would do." He was quiet for a moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on something difficult. "My father used to beat my mother," he said finally, his voice flat. "Not often. Just when he was angry or drunk or felt like she'd disrespected him. She never fought back, never left, just took it because that's what women did back then. Still do, in most places." Eliza's breath caught. She hadn't expected this glimpse into whatever had shaped him. "I was 12 when I finally got big enough to stop him. Stepped between them during one of his rages, took the beating meant for her." He paused, his hands tightening on the reins. He never touched her again after that. "But I learned something that day. I learned that having power over someone doesn't give you the right to hurt them. And I swore I'd never be the kind of man who used strength as an excuse for cruelty." "Is that why you helped me? Because I reminded you of your mother?" "Maybe partly." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "But mostly because I'm tired of watching the world grind down good people while the cruel ones prosper. Seemed like time to do something about it." They reached Salvation just as the church bells struck 10. The town was busy with Saturday market, people clustered around vendor stalls and wagon beds selling produce and goods. Eliza felt eyes turn toward them as Caleb helped her down from the wagon, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down like physical touch. "Hold your head up," Caleb said quietly. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." She straightened her spine and took his offered arm, letting him guide her through the crowd toward Morrison's general store. Whispers followed their progress, not even bothering to be subtle about it, She caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Heard they're living together now. Still strange, him taking on all those girls. Wonder what she's doing to keep him interested. The implications made her face burn, but she kept walking. Let them think what they wanted. She'd spent 12 years caring about Salvation's opinion, and it had bought her nothing but suffering. Inside Morrison's, the shopkeeper's expression went carefully neutral when he saw them together. Mr. Rowan. Mrs. Rowan. What can I do for you folks? Need flour, sugar, coffee, Caleb said. Also fabric if you've got any new stock. The girls are growing fast. Morrison began pulling items from shelves while Eliza wandered the store, running her fingers over bolts of fabric that were far nicer than anything she'd been able to afford before. There was a deep blue cotton that would look beautiful on Clara, a soft green that would suit Ruth's complexion. Get what you need, Caleb said from behind her. Don't worry about the cost. This is too much. It's not. His voice was firm. Your daughters deserve clothes that fit and look nice. Let me do this. There was something in his tone that made her throat tight. Not pity, but a kind of fierce determination that these girls would have what they'd been denied. She selected fabric for new dresses, trying not to calculate the cost, trying to believe she was allowed to take up space and resources without apologizing. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Margaret Hart's voice cut across the street. How touching, the happy couple playing house. Eliza turned to find her former mother-in-law standing with Thomas Jr. and a woman Eliza didn't recognize, thin and stern-faced, carrying herself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Mrs. Hart, Caleb said evenly. Thought we agreed you'd stay off my property. This isn't your property. This is a public street. Margaret gestured to the stranger. This is Mrs. Adelaide Thornton. She's been appointed by the territorial court to conduct a formal welfare assessment of the Hart children. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward, her sharp eyes cataloging everything about Eliza, her worn dress, her work-roughened hands, the way she stood close to Caleb like she needed his protection. Mrs. Rowan, she said crisply, I'll need to schedule a home visit to inspect the living conditions and interview the children about their care and treatment. We already had an inspection, Eliza said. An informal inspection. I've been engaged to conduct a thorough assessment, Mrs. Thornton pulled out a small leather notebook. I'm authorized to examine the home, review the children's health and education, and determine whether the current arrangement is in their best interests. The current arrangement, Caleb said slowly, is that they're living with their mother and stepfather in a warm house with plenty of food. I'm failing to see what needs assessing. Nevertheless, the court has ordered a formal review. Mrs. Thornton's smile was professional and cold. I can conduct it with your cooperation or without it, but it will be conducted. Eliza felt the trap closing. This woman wasn't like the Reverend or the lawyer. She carried real authority, backed by real legal power. Refusing her would only make things worse. When? She asked quietly. Tomorrow. I'll arrive at 10 in the morning. I expect full access to the home and the children. Mrs. Thornton snapped her notebook shut. Any attempt to coach the children or present a false picture of their living conditions will be noted in my report. There's nothing false about how we live, Caleb said, his voice hard. Then you have nothing to worry about. Mrs. Thornton turned to Margaret. I'll send my findings to the court within the week. They departed, leaving Eliza and Caleb standing beside their half-loaded wagon. Around them, the Saturday market crowd pretended not to stare while clearly listening to every word. They're not going to stop, Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. No matter what we do, they'll keep finding new ways to attack us. Then we keep defending. Caleb resumed loading supplies, his movements sharp with controlled anger. Let this Thornton woman come. She'll see 6 healthy children in a good home with parents who care about them. What report can she possibly write that would justify removal? You don't know, Margaret. She'll find something. Some tiny flaw to exploit, some regulation we're violating, some reason to claim the girls aren't safe. Eliza's hands shook as she helped lift a flour sack. She won't stop until she's destroyed everything. Then we make sure there's nothing to find. He secured the load with practiced efficiency. Tonight, we go through everything. Make sure the house is perfect, the girls are prepared, there's no ammunition for criticism. They finished loading in tense silence and headed back to the ranch. The ride felt shorter somehow, urgency pushing them forward. When they arrived, Caleb gathered all 6 girls in the main room. "Tomorrow, a woman named Mrs. Thornton is coming to inspect our home," he said, his voice serious but not frightening. "She's going to ask you questions about how you're treated here, about food, sleeping arrangements, whether anyone hits you or scares you." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Will she take us away?" "Not if we're honest." He knelt down to her level. "I need you all to tell the truth. Don't try to make things sound better than they are, and don't make them sound worse. Just tell her what your life is really like here. Can you do that?" 6 heads nodded, though fear shadowed their young faces. "Good." He stood, looking at each girl in turn. "You're smart, brave children. I'm proud to be your father. Remember that tomorrow when you're scared." The simple declaration, calling himself their father, claiming them with such certainty, seemed to steady them. Eliza watched her daughters draw strength from his conviction and felt something shift in her chest. This man who'd been a stranger 6 weeks ago had become the bedrock they built their security on. That night, they prepared. Eliza scrubbed the house until it gleamed, washed and mended every piece of clothing, organized the pantry with military precision. Caleb checked and rechecked the barn, the livestock, the outbuildings. They worked past midnight, driven by fear and determination in equal measure. When they finally collapsed into bed, Eliza in the bed, Caleb on his pallet, exhaustion should have brought sleep. Instead, they both lay awake in the darkness. "What if it's not enough?" Eliza whispered. "What if she finds some reason to take them anyway?" "Then we fight harder." Caleb's voice came from the floor, steady and sure. "We get a lawyer, we appeal to the territorial court, we make enough noise that someone has to listen." "You do that? Keep fighting even though you could just let them go?" The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then she heard movement, him sitting up, his silhouette visible against the window's faint moonlight. "Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Those girls are mine now. Not because of a marriage certificate or legal obligation, but because I chose them. Same way I chose you. And I don't walk away from people I've chosen." The words hung in the darkness, heavy with meaning. Eliza felt tears slip down her temples, soaking into her pillow. "Why?" she asked. "Why choose us? We're nothing but trouble and need, and you're 6 brave children and a mother who refused to break even when the world demanded it. You're worth choosing." He paused. "You're worth everything I can give." She wanted to respond, to tell him what his certainty meant to her, but emotion closed her throat. Instead, she just whispered, "Thank you. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard." But sleep wouldn't come. Eliza lay in the darkness, listening to Caleb's breathing even out, and tried to prepare herself for whatever the morning would bring. Mrs. Thornton arrived precisely at 10, stepping down from her hired wagon with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. She was accompanied by a young man carrying a leather case, presumably her assistant or secretary. "Mr. and Mrs. Rowan," she nodded crisply. "Shall we begin?" For the next 3 hours, she examined everything. She inspected the kitchen, noting the cleanliness and well-stocked pantry. She examined the bedrooms, checking mattresses and bedding and sleeping arrangements. She reviewed the girls' clothing, their books, their few toys. She questioned Eliza about daily routines, meal planning, educational activities. She questioned Caleb about finances, future plans, his commitment to the children's welfare. Then she interviewed the girls. One by one, she took them into the kitchen while Eliza and Caleb waited in agonized silence in the main room. Sarah went first, her small voice barely audible through the door. Then Johanna, then Anne, then Mary, then Ruth. Clara went last, her young face set with determination. Each interview lasted about 15 minutes. Each felt like an eternity. When Clara finally emerged, Mrs. Thornton gathered her papers and stood. "I'll submit my report to the court within 3 days," she said. "You should receive notification of any proceedings shortly thereafter." "What did you find?" Eliza couldn't help asking. Did we... "My findings will be in my official report." Mrs. Thornton's expression revealed nothing. "Good day, Mr. and Mrs. Rowan." She left, taking all certainty with her. Eliza sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "What did she ask you?" she asked Clara. if we had enough food, if anyone hit us, if we were afraid. Claire's voice was small. I told her the truth, Mama. I told her we're happy here, that Mr. Rowan is kind and you're not sad anymore, and we feel safe for the first time ever. You did perfect, sweet girl. Eliza pulled her oldest daughter into a hug. All of you did perfect. But perfect might not be enough. Not when Margaret Hart had money and influence and an implacable determination to win. The waiting was agony. 3 days stretched into 4, then 5. No word came from the court. Eliza went through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, caring for her daughters, but fear shadowed every moment. On the 6th day, Sheriff Coleman rode up to the ranch. Eliza's heart stopped when she saw him. This was it, the court's decision, the moment when everything either held together or fell apart. Sheriff, Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his face carefully neutral. What brings you out here? Coleman dismounted slowly, his weathered face troubled. Got news from the territorial court about the Hart children. Eliza emerged from the house, her daughters clustering behind her like always. She couldn't read Coleman's expression, couldn't tell if he brought salvation or devastation. Mrs. Thornton filed her report, he said. Court reviewed it yesterday. And? Caleb's voice was steady, but Eliza could see tension in his shoulders. And the court has ruled that the children remain in your custody, permanently. Coleman pulled out a document. Judge Morrison said, and I quote, the children are clearly thriving in a stable, loving home with adequate resources and appropriate care. There are no grounds for removal. The words took a moment to penetrate. Then Eliza's knees buckled. Caleb caught her before she fell, his arms strong and steady around her. They're ours, she whispered. Truly ours? Truly yours. Coleman handed Caleb the document. Court also issued an order barring the Hart family from any further custody challenges without new evidence of abuse or neglect. Margaret tried to appeal, but Judge Morrison shut her down. Said he was tired of wealthy families using the courts to harass people they didn't like. Margaret must have been furious, Caleb said. Furious doesn't begin to cover it. Coleman's mouth twitched toward a smile. She threatened to appeal to the territorial governor. Judge Morrison told her to go right ahead, but she'd be wasting her time and money. Behind Eliza, the girls were starting to understand. Clara began crying. Ruth hugged Mary. The younger ones started asking questions all at once. Does this mean Grandma Hart can't take us away? Sarah's voice rose above the others. That's exactly what it means, Coleman confirmed. You're staying right here with your mama and Mr. Rowan. Nobody can change that. The celebration was quiet but profound. After Coleman left, they all stood on the porch together, 7 females and 1 man who'd chosen to be their family. No one spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what they were feeling. Finally, Caleb cleared his throat. We should do something to mark this. Make it official somehow. Like what? Clara asked. Like, he thought for a moment. Like planting a tree, 1 for each of you girls. Something that'll grow with you, put down roots, last beyond all of us. It was the perfect gesture, practical and symbolic in equal measure. They spent the afternoon selecting spots around the house and planting 7 young aspen saplings Caleb had been nurturing in the barn. Each girl planted her own tree, patting soil around roots and watering them with careful attention. These will be here long after we're gone, Caleb said, watching them work. Proof that you belonged here, that this was your home. That night, after the girls were asleep, Eliza found Caleb on the porch. He sat in one of the chairs, looking out at the moonlit mountains, his expression distant. Thank you, she said, settling into the chair beside him. For what? For everything, for marrying me, for protecting my daughters, for being the kind of man who plants trees to make children feel like they belong. She paused. For choosing us when you didn't have to. He was quiet for a long moment. You keep thanking me like I did you some great favor. But the truth is, this arrangement saved me as much as it saved you. How? I was turning into the kind of man who doesn't feel anything, who keeps everyone at a distance because it's safer than risking connection. He turned to look at her. You and those girls gave me something to care about again, gave me a reason to be more than just a man working land until he dies alone. The honesty in his voice made Eliza's chest ache. "You're not alone anymore." "No, I'm not." He smiled slightly. "Takes some getting used to having people around all the time. But I'm learning. We all are." She looked out at the mountains, the trees they'd planted, the solid house that was finally, truly home. Learning how to be a family. Think we're doing all right at it? "I think we're doing better than all right." She glanced at him. "I think we're actually happy." It was true. Somewhere in the past 6 weeks, between biscuit lessons and shared bedrooms and fighting for custody of 6 daughters, happiness had crept in. Not the dramatic kind from storybooks, but the quiet kind built from safety and respect and small kindnesses accumulated over time. "Eliza," he said her name carefully, like he was testing how it felt. "I know this marriage started as a legal arrangement, but it doesn't have to stay that way. If you ever felt—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with emotional territory. But Eliza understood what he was trying to say. "Are you asking if I'd consider this marriage becoming real?" she asked gently. "I'm saying I'd like that. Eventually. If you wanted it too." He looked at her directly. "But only if you want it. Only if you choose me the way I chose you." The declaration should have frightened her. After 12 years of marriage as obligation, the idea of choosing a husband felt foreign. But looking at Caleb, this man who'd stood beside her against the world, who'd made her daughters laugh, who'd given her space to heal, she found the idea didn't frighten her at all. "I'm not ready yet," she said honestly. "I need more time to know what I want instead of what I need." "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." It was the perfect answer, patient and certain in equal measure. Eliza reached over and took his hand, feeling his calloused palm against hers. He looked surprised, but didn't pull away, just curled his fingers around hers and held on. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The next weeks brought their own rhythm. With the threat of custody challenges finally resolved, the household settled into something approaching normalcy. The girls flourished, gaining weight, losing the haunted look that had shadowed their eyes, learning to take up space without apologizing for it. Clara developed a passion for ranching, following Caleb everywhere and absorbing knowledge about cattle and land management. Ruth discovered Caleb's small library and began teaching herself mathematics from his old textbooks. Mary took over much of the cooking, her gentle nature finding expression in feeding people she loved. Anne and Johanna explored the surrounding wilderness, bringing home treasures and stories. Sarah simply bloomed like a flower given proper sun, her laughter becoming a regular feature of their days. And Eliza learned to breathe again. It started small, noticing she'd gone a whole day without fear tightening her chest, realizing she'd laughed at something Ruth said without immediately checking whether anyone would punish her for joy, catching her reflection and seeing a woman who looked rested instead of hunted. She started singing while she worked, started making plans that extended beyond surviving the next week, started believing that good things might actually last. One morning, about 2 months after the court's ruling, Eliza woke to find Caleb already dressed and sitting by the window, reading. It was Sunday, his one day of relative rest, and she'd expected him to sleep late. "Everything all right?" she asked, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. He looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Been thinking. The girls need proper education. Clara's smart enough for university if she wanted it. Ruth, too. Mary's got a gift for hospitality that could take her places. Education costs money. I have money, and land that generates income. We could afford to send them to good schools when they're old enough. Give them choices about their futures." The idea was so radical it took her breath away. Working-class girls didn't go to university. They married young or found work as domestics or teachers if they were lucky. The idea of her daughters having actual choices, actual opportunities. "You do that?" she asked. "Spend your money educating girls who aren't even your blood?" "They're my daughters. That makes them my blood in every way that matters." He set down his book. "And yes, I'd do that. I'd do anything to give them the chances they deserve." Eliza crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. "Caleb Rowan, you are the best man I've ever known." He looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just trying to do right by them." "You're doing more than right. You're giving them a future. She took his hand. You're giving all of us a future. His thumb traced circles on her palm, the touch gentle and questioning. What kind of future do you want, Eliza? It was the question she'd been avoiding. For so long, survival had been the only goal. But now, with safety secured and fear receding, she could actually consider what she wanted instead of just what she needed. I want this, she said slowly. This house, these children, this life we're building. I want to wake up without being afraid. I want my daughters to grow up knowing they're valued. And I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want a real marriage. With you. Not just on paper, but in truth. His hand tightened on hers. You're sure? I'm sure. You've been patient with me, kind to my daughters, decent in ways I didn't know men could be. I choose you, Caleb, the way you chose me. The kiss was gentle, a question answered, a promise made. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. I should warn you, he said, I'm not good with words. I'm not romantic. I'm just a rancher who prefers cows to conversation. That's all right. I'm just a woman who prefers honesty to poetry. She touched his face. We'll figure it out together. And they did. Their marriage became real in increments, shared conversations late into the night, his hand finding hers while they worked, goodnight kisses that grew less tentative with time. It wasn't the passionate romance of storybooks, but it was something better, a partnership built on respect and care and the daily choice to show up for each other. Winter came, bringing snow that transformed the ranch into a wonderland. The girls had never seen so much snow, never had the luxury of playing in it instead of just enduring it. Caleb taught them to build snow forts and have snowball fights, his rare laughter joining theirs. Christmas was simple but joyful. Caleb carved wooden toys for each girl and bought fabric for new dresses. Eliza made a quilt using scraps of cloth from all their old dresses, a tapestry of their journey from poverty to security. The girls gave gifts they'd made themselves, drawings, carved wooden spoons, a scarf Ruth had knitted in secret. On Christmas night, after the girls were asleep, Eliza and Caleb sat by the fire. I never thought I'd have this, she said quietly. A real home. A husband who sees me as a person instead of just a womb for sons. Children who feel safe enough to laugh. Neither did I. He pulled her close. Thought I'd live alone until I died. Didn't know I was lonely until I had you all here filling up the empty spaces. Are you happy? He considered the question seriously. Yeah, I am. Are you? Happier than I ever imagined possible. It was true. The woman who'd been beaten in the street, who'd watched her children nearly taken away, who'd married a stranger out of desperation. That woman had found not just safety, but joy, not just survival, but a life worth living. The years that followed brought their own challenges and triumphs. Clara went to university in Denver, studying agriculture and returning with revolutionary ideas about cattle breeding. Ruth became a teacher, using her mathematical mind to help other children discover the beauty of numbers. Mary opened a boarding house in Salvation, her gentle hospitality making it the most sought-after accommodation in the territory. Anne and Johanna traveled together, documenting the wilderness they loved through art and writing. Sarah, the youngest, surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, fighting in courtrooms for women and children who needed advocates. Through it all, Eliza and Caleb remained the foundation their family built on. Their love grew deeper with time, seasoned by shared work and weathered storms and the quiet satisfaction of watching their daughters thrive. Margaret Hart never forgave them, but her influence waned as years passed and new scandals captured the town's attention. Eventually, she faded into bitter old age, her efforts to destroy the Rowan family nothing but failed memories. Eliza never forgot the woman who'd beaten her in the street, but she also never let that woman's judgment define her worth again. She'd learned something precious in those hard early days of her marriage to Caleb, that worth wasn't determined by how many sons you bore or how well you pleased powerful people. Worth was inherent in your courage, your love for your children, your refusal to break even when breaking seemed inevitable. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Eliza stood beneath the aspen trees they'd planted so many years ago. The saplings had grown tall and strong, their white bark marked with the passage of time, their roots deep in Montana soil. Look at them, Eliza said, touching the bark of Clara's tree. So much bigger than I ever imagined they'd get. That's the thing about roots, Caleb said, his arm around her waist. You give them good soil and room to grow, they'll exceed every expectation. Are we talking about trees or daughters? Both, he smiled. Definitely both. Their daughters had gathered for the anniversary, all 6 of them successful and strong and secure in the knowledge they were valued. They'd brought their own children, giving Caleb and Eliza a swarm of grandchildren who filled the house with noise and laughter. At dinner that night, Clara raised her glass. To the 2 people who taught us that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice, about showing up every day and choosing to love and protect and support each other. She looked at her mother and stepfather. Thank you for choosing us, and for teaching us how to choose ourselves. Hear, hear, the others echoed. Eliza felt tears on her cheeks. Looking around the table at her daughters and grandchildren, at the man who'd stood beside her through everything, at the home they'd built from nothing but need and courage and stubborn refusal to give up, she felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was what victory looked like. Not dramatic or immediate, but earned through years of small choices to be kind, to be patient, to believe that people were worth fighting for. Later, when the house had quieted and the grandchildren were sleeping, Eliza and Caleb walked out to the aspen grove. The trees rustled in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to the Montana sky. Any regrets? Caleb asked. Eliza thought about the question seriously. 25 years of marriage, 6 daughters raised to adulthood, a life built from the ashes of desperation and transformed into something beautiful. Not a single one, she said. You? Only that I didn't find you sooner. He pulled her close. Could have had more years together. We have enough. We have exactly what we're supposed to have. She leaned into his warmth. A home built on choice instead of obligation. Children who know they're loved. And each other. Each other, he agreed. That's the important part. They stood together in the grove, 2 people who'd chosen each other when the world said they shouldn't, who'd built a family from need and necessity and transformed it into something transcendent. Around them, the aspen trees stood tall and strong, living proof that even the smallest sapling, given proper care and protected space to grow, could become something magnificent. And in the house beyond the grove, lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness. Inside, their daughters laughed and their grandchildren played, and the future they'd fought so hard to secure unfolded exactly as it should. Eliza Hart, who'd once been beaten in the street for the crime of bearing daughters, had become Eliza Rowan, a woman who'd learned to stand, to fight, to claim her worth regardless of what others thought. She'd found a partner who saw her value, daughters who made her proud, and a life that proved kindness could survive in a harsh world if people chose to practice it. The story that began with violence and shame ended with love and dignity. Not because the world had changed. It hadn't, not really. But because 2 people had chosen to be different, to see each other's humanity, to build something better than what existed before. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 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 It was everything.